Hi and welcome back to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. And if you are a regular watcher, yes, I look a bit battered and bruised and swollen because I've just had really major surgery on my nose, but because I did say and make a promise to you all that I would be crime consistent, i.e. I would always release my content on a Wednesday and a Sunday, that in spite of the fact I probably have like 2 weeks before I'll start to look normal, I'm going to record my YouTube anyway. Also, I'm so swollen on this side of my face because I've had rib cartilage put in my bridge and I've had ear cartilage put in my nostrils, meaning that my ears hurt and my rib hurts as well. And because it's been so extensive, literally this side of my face in particular is just like majorly swollen. But I can smell a little bit, which isn't something that I've been able to do for a long time, and my nose isn't going to just kind of collapse anymore. Thanks to the endoscopic sinus surgery that I suffered where they collapsed my bridge, bringing back my smell. That never happened. But that's enough about me. If you're new to this channel, I don't usually talk about things like this, and I don't usually look like this either. So just bear with me for the next few videos. Normal face will be resumed in like a month. Today I'm going to cover a case that you guys have asked for me to cover constantly. It's a British case. It was probably one of the biggest cases that hit the news. It really is one of those. It marks actually 20 years since this crime took place this year. And I did and ah about doing this because obviously a lot of people have talked about this, and you know the way that I feel, I always want to add some value to the specifics in this case, and I also want to make sure that I do the individuals who lost their lives proud as far as telling their story diligently. But even though it's taken a lot of research, guys, I'm not gonna lie, it has been extensive. I finally put it together and I am going to cover the Soham Murders because it was a case that was powerful for me. I was a younger woman, obviously, and my sister was actually in labour when Holly and Jessica went missing. So as a unit, this is evocative and provocative for a lot of reasons within our family. So as I said, it's 20 years since the murder of 2 10-year-old girls in Soham in Cambridgeshire. Beautiful area, by the way, a lovely area. Leafy, green, safe. And it was a crime that shocked the nation. It shocked the world with respect. And if anything, when I think about the passage of time, what has actually occurred with that passage of time is that we've been able to really explore and examine and shine a spotlight on what I consider missed opportunities. Because there were missed opportunities that, had they been picked up on, those girls would never have died. It's as simple as that. We're talking about a chain of causation resulting in 2 beautiful, absolutely adored, full of potential children who should never have lost their lives. And of course, no child should ever lose their life. We cover those cases on here. But when you look at certain cases and you can literally track the failures leading ultimately to the loss of that life, it's frustrating, and it's really important that we talk about them. We're talking about a man, a monster, who took 2 lives, who devastated so many more in the ripple effect of that consequence. Ian Kevin Huntley, that's the name that so many of you will recognise. It became notorious in the summer of 2002. He was born on the 31st of January 1974. That's in the port of Immingham, which is just outside a place called Grimsby. He was the first son of Kevin and Linda, and he ended up with 1 younger brother. His younger brother was called Wayne, and Wayne was born in 1975, so relatively close together. He was described within the family unit as being a mummy's boy when he was younger, so clearly there was a tension there. If you're described as a mummy's boy, it means that often you can do no wrong. She's your safe place and your safe space. it denotes a close relationship. Sometimes a close relationship that others feel is a little bit detrimental because it can come across that a child is super needy. But hey, I've got 2 boys. I hope they are both considered mummy's boys because I adore them. He would also in early childhood be seen to throw tantrums. He often wanted to get attention, and he learned early on that a way of achieving and attaining that was to act out angrily. Also worth noting that even though he's a mummy's boy, his dad was actually known as a very stern man, and Ian Huntley was apparently quite afraid of him. So he was the punisher in the relationship to some degree. He was the disciplinarian towards Huntley. So we have the protector on one side, his mother, and we have the individual who does that discipline on the other side, his father. We also know that when we look at certain serial killers, we can see that parenting styles where one is very liberal and one is very stern can be a contributor. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't a close relationship between Huntley and his dad. There was, and they did things together as a family. And one of the things that his father was really interested in was he liked going to the docks, because where Grimsby is, there are a lot of docks, Hull, etc. And these areas are places where ships come in and go out. So Huntley's father would take him and his younger brother Wayne to the docks to watch the ships. And it's believed that this is where Ian started to like objects, shall we say, so in this case ships, but it progressed and he really connected with a passion for planes, and it was especially military aircraft that primarily interested him. And often we will say on personality levels, when you test personalities of women and men, women are more into relationships, men are more into things. There are a lot of things that make us very similar as men and women, but men tend to have more of a thing for things than women do, and women have to have more of a thing for relationships often than men do. We all care deeply for one another, I know. I'm just saying, that's what personality tests tend to denote. But he falls in love with military aircraft, and it's something that stays with him throughout his life. When I looked at his schooling, okay, he didn't stand out. So he wasn't an individual who had a real connection with academia, but he was average. So he also didn't necessarily struggle academically. He's one of those kids that didn't stand out for any particular reason, aside from the fact that some of his friends, or shall I say, people who knew him, so people who kind of were aware of him in school, said that one of the issues with Ian Huntley was that he was a bit of a loner. He was somebody who didn't necessarily know how to build effective relationships. And like occurs for a lot of children who maybe don't fit in or maybe seem a little bit different, he ends up getting bullied, which would be deeply traumatizing, of course. When you are bullied, you feel that no one cares about you. You feel that there is something significantly different about you than your peers. It makes you desperate to just want to feel safe. And if it's consistent, it wrecks your life. It's as simple as that. So he definitely had problems with peers, and those peers were not kind to him. And it didn't end when he was at primary school. It continued. In fact, it got a lot worse. He started Healing Comprehensive School. The bullying got so bad that his parents felt it was appropriate for him to be moved. So ultimately, he transferred to a school in Immingham, which was Immingham Comprehensive. That's when he was 13 years of age. We can all imagine that if the bullying has got so intolerable that our parents have had to intervene, that is a high level of bullying. And we can all imagine how that can at times provoke withdrawal in somebody because relationships don't necessarily feel safe. It can also start a rage, a sense of people aren't to be trusted, and that we feel that we wish to have retribution to some degree. And on top of that, it can create power control dynamics, which is a sense of, I don't want to ever be in that situation again. I don't want to be an individual who feels vulnerable. And so for some individuals, you can start building, shall we say, a protective mechanism and wall around you psychologically so that you're not going to be in that situation again. And remember, Huntley is going through a very fragile time. He's 13. He's been bullied for quite a few years. So he's in the middle of his adolescence dealing with these really challenging feelings. One of the reasons that people bullied him was because they said he had a large forehead. And he had nicknames including the White Cliff of Dover. For those of you who do not know the White Cliff of Dover or the White Cliffs of Dover, in Dover there are these huge cliffs and they have white fronts, so that's the way it looks. So you can imagine what they were saying. He's a white kid and he's got a massive forehead. Simple as that. They also called him Spacehead. Now, I will be honest with you, part of the reason for that was he just didn't connect with his peers and he spent a lot of time by himself. So he didn't ultimately ingratiate himself to his peers in a way that diminished those kind of slurs, but it must have been really tough for him. And one of the things that may have actually contributed a little bit, it shouldn't have, guys, it shouldn't have, please don't think I'm saying that I think this guy needs to be bullied because of what he did. I'm just saying that if bullies are already calling you the White Cliff of Dover and Spacehead, and they see you as different, and they don't necessarily want to build relationships with you, then setting up the Grimsby and Immingham chapter of the Bros fan club was not likely going to enamour you further. And that's what he did. He set up the Grimsby and Immingham chapter of the Bros fan club. I mean, Bros was super successful at some point, weren't they? I remember people used to wear Grolsch tops on their shoes, and that apparently meant that you were a fan of Bros. I don't know. I never really was into that stuff. But the point is, if you're already getting bullied and you set something up like that, then chances are people are going to use that as ammunition against you, and that happened. Now, when he's 13, dealing with some chaos as I'm talking about now, if you think about the fact that he had already this passion for planes, it kind of became bigger for him. He decided that he wanted to join the RAF. So at 13, he joins the Air Training Corps. So whilst we've got some dysfunction in his life with the bullying, and certainly he's not fitting in as he would like to, we're seeing aspirations. He's certainly not struggling terribly academically, and it looks like he's got some really good dreams. His family life hasn't been particularly problematic. We're going in the right direction, aren't we? And to all intents and purposes, people who knew him at that point reported that aside from the bullying, which is traumatic, it seems like he had a really happy and secure childhood, at least until this point. But then we get a switch. And it's a really big switch. Because when he was 13 years of age, he catches his dad in bed with his 16-year-old babysitter. I mean, the idea of walking in on your parents having sex is something that could make us choose to abstain personally for the rest of our lives. But the idea of walking in on your friggin' babysitter who's just 16 years of age, which I find highly questionable. A 16-year-old with a father of a 13-year-old in bed worries me anyway. I know it's legal, guys. I just don't think it should be. Genuinely, I think those kind of age gaps are not necessarily effectively good for the child in the situation. And at 16, you're still a child. You can't even vote. So he walks in, he's got this familiarity that it's his babysitter and his much loved father. And they're having sex. Now, in this situation, Ian Huntley is the victim. He shouldn't be seeing this. This should not be playing out in front of his eyes. And his father in this moment had one job: to take responsibility, to be accountable, to apologise, and to ensure that Ian Huntley isn't any more desperately affected by this heinous scene that's played out in front of him. But that isn't what happens. His dad gets really aggressive and he literally threatens him to secrecy. And it really feels, from what I've researched and read about him, that there's a big turning point in Ian Huntley's behaviour. By the way, guys, just as a caveat, at no point am I going to excuse him for any of his actions and reactions, by the way. At the end of the day, there is something born bad about this human, in my opinion. But just to give you the backstory, it's important I offer balance. So this is a traumatic moment for Huntley. And without doubt, he would have felt betrayed by his father. He would have been made to lie to his mother. And of course, we know that he had a really close relationship with his mother. So that in itself would be incredibly conflicting. But there's another layer to this, and it's a layer that's really important. When your primary caregiver doesn't just give you permission to lie to another primary caregiver, they demand it. They completely change your perception of the world. Like, kids lie, we all lie. It's a part of being human. But we hold our parents often to a higher level of behaviour. And we expect them to be the individuals that pull us up by our socks when we get things wrong and make us recognise that we have failed. It is the duty and job of a loving parent to remind us and to hold us to account when we lie and are deceptive. They're the people who tell us why it's not acceptable. They make us recognise the error of our ways. And that's what great parents are meant to do. So if suddenly that parent that we've always believed held us to that level of account says, well, you know what, actually, when it comes down to it, I've slept with the babysitter and all of those lessons that I taught you, like, just ignore them now, because at the end of the day, I'm having sex with a 16-year-old babysitter and I really don't want your mum to know. So I'm going to now threaten you and say, you lie. You just go ahead and lie. Well, who's going to hold you to account from then on? If you are legitimately allowed to lie to your mother, to betray her that way, if you're allowed to collude with the betrayal of your father and be told that that's the right thing to do, even though it's under duress and threat, well, from that point on, are you going to really see the world in the same way? Or are you going to imagine that when it comes down to it, if your primary caregiver, your disciplinarian, your father is giving you permission to get what you want from the world by manipulating it through deception, that is a powerful lesson. And if there is a chink in your armor, let's say, you've been born genetically with a predisposition for certain types of behavior, and then somebody gives you a great big tick permission-wise to use being duplicitous, deceptive, downright threatening to get what you want, what if that activates something in you? What if it activates that reality that you'd never really thought about because you'd always been controlled to some degree by the shackles of parenting, by the truth-telling that's expected in that world, and then suddenly you are free of them? What else could that activate? Just posing that question. But I think for most parents, we're always aware that if we want to bring up pro-social children, if we want to make sure that we grow them into adults that are good for this world, we teach them by our example. And we know that if we fall short on that, we're going to do damage, and damage is done. And it seems that after that event, well, lying, it becomes second nature to him. The plaster that held truth in, that kept deception out, has been ripped off. And the worlds of fantasy and reality, they just begin to synergize in a way that soon become damaging to others. Now, around this time, aside from the fact that he starts lying, also his behaviour switches. He really does begin to change. In fact, he becomes a bully himself. And we can all appreciate that he's been through a difficult time and that he didn't deserve to be bullied. But now he's choosing that path. And whilst we can say, yes, on a power and control level, he wants to be the person causing the harm as opposed to the person being harmed, we can also look at the research that says people who turn into bullies often have higher levels of self-esteem and self-security and arrogance than those who do not bully. Because he doesn't need to take that path, does he? He doesn't need to bully anyone. As long as he's not being attacked and he can just get on with his life. Well, surely he's experienced the horror of how it feels to be a victim. Why then would you wish to cause other that victimization? It just shows that he can know willingly what he's doing to another human being and do it anyway. So again, we're seeing another activation. This level of behaviour and malevolence that is beginning to find itself within Huntley's nature. On one occasion, this is when he's 15, he chokes a 14-year-old boy. And he choked him really badly. The kid was incredibly distressed and thought that he might die. The people who knew Huntley said that when he did it, it was as if he was trying to prove himself. And then he had this behaviour switch where people actually suggested that he had this idea that he wanted to act like he was one of the Krays. So I'm sure that anybody listening to this is into true crime. You'll know Ronnie and Reggie Kray, the Kray brothers. They were individuals who caused havoc in the East End of London. They were gangsters and they were also celebrities, but everybody wanted to be their friends at the time. So Huntley is modelling his behaviour on what he considers popular icons. But also, and I've not seen a lot about this in documentaries with respect, because I have watched a few documentaries in my time about the Soham murders, and I have actually appeared on television shows about these particular murders, and I hadn't necessarily done the kind of research that I now do for YouTube. So even though I was looking for behaviours that were concerning in his childhood, I hadn't necessarily looked into it to this depth and level. Now I appreciate that there were also some very disturbing behaviours around animals. So he allegedly killed a 6-month-old puppy, and he killed that puppy because it disobeyed him. And he was also known to tie bangers and fireworks to cats. We all know when we're looking at particularly issues that are classified such as antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, so on and so forth, what we can tell is that often an individual will initially hurt animals before graduating onto hurting children or hurting adults, hurting people in general. And he's doing this. And you can imagine the level of distress. Obviously, he caused the puppy because he killed the puppy. But for those cats, we've all seen how terrified cats are when they hear loud noises. If you tie bangers and fireworks to cats, aside from the agony that they're going to experience because they're going to get burnt, it's the shock. It's being able to do something that you know that you can witness their fear, their terror, their horror, their pain. And that's what Huntley wants to do. Even from an early age, from a teenager, he wants to cause pain. He wants to witness the impact of controlling another animal's, in this position, experience of the world in a horrifically negative way. I also cannot bear animal cruelty. I find it so difficult to comprehend how anyone of any age could harm an animal. Certainly when you're looking at teenagers onwards, people are aware of what they are doing. They are causing something pain. And to do that to a sentient creature is just mind-blowing to me. And it says something really dangerous about the character of that human being. Also, Again, there were reports that when he was a teenager, Huntley may also have actually been a victim of abuse himself. This came from people who were friends with him or were on the periphery of friendships with him, but used to hang out with him, particularly when he had become this bully. Because as we know, no one wants to get bullied. So when there's a bully at large, people will often hang around them to avoid being a victim. And some of the boys who used to hang out with him said that he used to see a guy called Vern. Vern was a sex offender, and he'd actually spent time in prison for raping a young boy. So this isn't a guy who was suspected of child molestation and rape. This is a guy who'd served time. Vern had served time for doing that reprehensible crime. Now, Vern was known to loiter around public toilets near where Huntley lived, which again, massive alarm bell. What was he even being allowed around a public toilet? Because you know, kids go to public toilets, don't they? These kind of individuals who've been in prison for raping children, they need to be constantly monitored, because otherwise they're going to get access to the type of victim that they want. Now, Vern obviously got into conversations with Huntley, because it got to a point where Huntley would actually go into the cubicle with him. So he'd go into a cubicle with Vern, and he'd come out with a £5 note or with £5. Well, that is terrifying to me. And on one level, I appreciate that Huntley is a teenager and he is apparently choosing to carry out that action, but he's a kid, he can't consent. This is a child predator that he's around. But he's earning money potentially from it. And also to his friends, it felt like very, very strange behaviour. He also sustained a head injury. This is when he was 15 years of age. And he got into a fight and he got severely, severely beaten. And one of the things that people noted was when he was in that fight, whilst he was on the ground, he got kicked in the head as he lay on the ground. And there's a lot of research on brain injury and the impact that that can have on impulse control. And certainly when you look at serial killers and highly violent offenders, you can often note that there has been some head injury. I'm not saying that that is what causes the behaviour. I'm just saying that contributory factors are really important to note. As I told you earlier on, Huntley was not a popular guy. Even when he was a bully, he certainly wasn't somebody that a lot of people wanted to hang around. He didn't have a lot of friends. But as he became more confident, shall we say, he starts seeing a few girls. And one of the things that is common amongst these girls is they're always a few years younger than him. You know, 1 or 2 years initially. And this becomes a recurring pattern. It seems like when he starts having these relationships with younger girls, he automatically connects with sexuality and a need to explore that sexuality. So these are not innocent relationships. We're talking about a guy who wants to explore the way that he feels sexually, and he goes for particularly vulnerable girls, and he starts showing some what I consider incredibly odd behaviour. So at 16 years of age, he goes to a 12-year-old girl's birthday party. Now, a lot of us can agree that we have family members who've got kids who are younger and they have friends and their friends have kids. So it's not unusual that a 16-year-old would be a 12-year-old's birthday party. No problem there. But he went up to that 12-year-old girl and he handed her a present, and they were red, sexy knickers. Yeah. That's what he handed over. A pair of red, sexy knickers, lingerie, if you will, to a 12-year-old girl for her present. I do have to ask myself whether, she opened those in front of a group of people. Got a Barbie, I've got a girl's world head, I've got lots of little nice dresses, got some tickets to go to a show off my mum, and I've got a pair of red, sexy knickers. Inappropriate beyond belief. Sorry, if that had happened to one of my children, not that it would have, the boys, But I'm just posing the question that if I were in a situation where my child of 12 were handed such a present by a 16-year-old male, I would march the 16-year-old male out of my property and say, never darken my doorstep again. You're clearly somebody I want my daughter to have nothing to do with. A little bit of advice there for parents, should that ever happen, which it won't, because that's how inappropriate it was. Now, after a few years of keeping the secret I told you about before, which is where Huntley's dad basically threatened him into silence, it seems like Huntley can't keep it in any longer. He's been carrying this sordid secret around. He's obviously now involved in relationships himself. He probably feels a little bit more grown up, and he does not believe, at least at this point, that he can contain that information anymore. Who knows, his relationship with his dad could be becoming more fractious. He could feel that his father doesn't deserve his mother at this point, and he can also potentially acknowledge that he has the absolute capacity to wield some kind of chaos over that relationship. Because if you tell your mum about your dad's betrayal, it's only going to go one way, isn't it? It's not going to improve the relationship at this point. So he tells his mum. She is obviously devastated, and she leaves her husband. She takes Wayne and Huntley with her. And his father at this point is absolutely incensed. He's furious with him. He feels absolutely betrayed. And it starts to create a behaviour in Huntley's father, which is really problematic. He starts drinking really heavily, and he gets really violent towards Huntley. Now this, without a doubt, has a deep impact on him, because he's been carrying around this horrible secret, and it's got to a point where either he just thought, I'm going to tell the truth, or I want my dad to pay. But as opposed to it coming out and his father acknowledging his own part to play in that situation, again, his father just projects everything onto Huntley, blames Huntley. So even when he's told the truth, he's punished for that. His parents actually officially split in 1993, and it's at this point his mum then gets involved with another woman. So she gets involved in a lesbian relationship. So that would be, as far as for Huntley and his brother Wayne, a slightly unusual time. They've had a 2.4 situation family, and now their mother is interested in a woman. They probably weren't prepared for that. And while she does absolutely nothing wrong in going and having a relationship with a woman, you can imagine that it may have had an impact on the way that they felt about their family unit, full stop. His dad at this point moves to East Anglia, and he has a new partner. So we have a completely broken home at this point. After Huntley leaves school, having dealt with, shall we say, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune and family life at this moment in time, he isn't looking for a big career. In fact, he just undertakes a lot of menial jobs. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with menial jobs. But what I'm saying is he's not looking at any kind of way of moving forward up the ranks in a particular career. And bear in mind that he had wanted to be in the forces earlier on. So he starts working as a security guard. He works as a fish factory worker, door-to-door salesman. So he's kind of not keeping jobs for very long periods of time. And that's important to know as well, because there is an inconsistent nature within the work that he does. And he loses jobs as well. According to his work colleagues, they said that whenever they were working with Ian Huntley, and it's not just at one place of work, there were several places of work that commented on him, they said that he made them feel really uncomfortable. He was particularly verbally abusive to female staff. So he would bully them about their looks, he would bully them about their weight. I mean, is it just me? But if I was working with you and you were verbally abusive to me, and then you dared to bully me about my looks, and my weight, I would have you sacked within seconds. Literally, that is beyond breaching boundaries. And I get it. You know, in the 80s and 90s, people did get away with a lot of things that they shouldn't have got away with. I acknowledge that. But wow, how dare he? It's not like he was the Calvin Klein model himself. That's all I'm saying. All I'm saying. Don't like a bully. Particularly don't like a man who thinks there is ever an acceptability level about being horrible to female colleagues and using their looks to beat them up, so to speak. Also, he lied constantly, literally constantly. So he claimed that he'd been an RAF pilot, he claimed that he had management posts, so he's always trying to prove himself. He wants people to think that he's more than he considers he is in his life. And I guess he was playing out that fantasy that he was in the RAF because he had wanted to do that. But he's a Walter Mitty. Because it's not a big area where he lives, guys. It really isn't. It would take like one trip to a different pub to ask the question, is Ian Huntley a pilot? No, he sells fish. I knew it. I knew he didn't look like a pilot. That kind of thing would occur regularly. So aside from Huntley living in this fantasy world, he also on a mental health level starts to decline around the age of 18. He starts suffering from depression. It feels like this is a reactive depression, which is largely due to the fact that his parents have split up. That was when he was 18, because there was a lot of acrimonious experience around that. Dad was very angry, he's drinking, mum's in a relationship with a female, everything feels very different to when they were being brought up, and this contributes a lot to his feeling of being very low. And when he was 18, he actually tries to kill himself, and then again he tries twice to kill himself when he's 20. So we can't underestimate that. He was obviously in a very, very, very dark place in those moments, and he was struggling with what his life had been and what his life had become. And also, as I've brought in, aside from the very dark shades to his nature, he could have been sexually molested as well, and that would have contributed, along with the bullying and those experiences that had been less than positive for him. In spite of obviously feeling quite bleak emotionally, he does manage, soon after his suicide attempt, to meet 17-year-old Claire Evans. He meets her in Grimsby, and it's a really intense, quickly moving relationship. He actually proposes to her after 2 months, and they get married really, really quickly. And there is some dysfunction in this because she doesn't tell her family. They're not even aware that she's dating somebody, and yet she marries him. So part of me thinks that she probably didn't think that her family was going to approve of that relationship, or arguably maybe it was that she didn't have the closest relationship with her family. But nonetheless, getting in a relationship and then getting married without telling anyone, I mean, that says something about immaturity, doesn't it? These are two young people. They haven't really had a lot of history. They've intensely connected, and now they're suddenly married. And that relationship, you will not be surprised, starts to fail. So it fails because he becomes physically very abusive to her. And one of the assaults was so serious that she actually miscarried his child. So we're talking high-level domestic violence at this point. And she's a kid. She's 17 when they met. And he's that controlling, domineering, and violent really early on in their relationship. Now, Claire isn't stupid. And because of that, the relationship only lasts a few months. And the reason for this is that she has a motivation to leave him because she falls for Ian Huntley's younger brother, Wayne. Now, for Wayne and for Claire, the connection was some that they could not avoid as far as they're concerned. But for Huntley, imagine that betrayal. Imagine how he would feel. He's already found his own father in bed with his babysitter. Now he's found his brother is in a relationship with his wife. He was so angry with this, so incensed at the loss of control, and also refusing to take responsibility for the fact that she had left Huntley for Wayne because Wayne was not going to treat her like a punch bag. He couldn't see any of that. All he felt was the ultimate sense of betrayal, and he actually refused to give Claire a divorce for years. He wanted to make it difficult for them to be together. It feels at this point he has had some very big difficulties, but wow, we are starting to see a very troubled young man. He's got this dysfunctional family background, he's got a failed marriage, and another thing has occurred, hasn't it? It's the trust of women has been impacted. And it feels that this is around the time, behaviour-wise, that things decline to a point where he starts showing up on the authorities around him's radar. And the main reason why the authorities become aware of Ian Huntley, and boy guys, I'm going to run through some of this. I don't want to bore you. I'm going to run through some of this because I need you to think all the way through this. Should Holly and Jessica ever have been in a position where this man had access to them? That's the question that we're posing in this particular video, right? And therefore, I need to show you just how profound and prolific the amount of Ian Huntley cropping up in areas such as social services and the police was occurring at this time, because it's mind-blowing. It was seen from really early on, when he hits his 18, 19-year-old type age, that he's got a massive predilection for underage girls. At 21 years of age, he's still going out with young teenagers. One of these teenagers was 15-year-old Katie Webber. And Katie actually went on to have his baby. And she said that according to her experience with Huntley, he was highly abusive. But one of the things that he did was very early on in the relationship, he manipulated her to move in with him. This is just after a few months of he and her seeing each other. And her parents actually called the police because obviously this is a 21-year-old guy with a 15-year-old girl. It's illegal and they want to know what's happening to their daughter. Huntley just manipulates them, says the relationship's completely platonic. And he manages, because obviously this young girl at the time is probably enamored by him, and then she's terrified of him, that she'll just agree with whatever he says. So he uses those classic abuser traits. He begins to isolate her. He subjects her to horrible humiliation in the relationship. He beats her. He repeatedly rapes her. He rapes her even when she's in the early stages of pregnancy. So he has absolutely no care and consideration for her own personal sexual boundaries, but he has absolutely no care or consideration for their unborn child. He doesn't care what happens to either of them. And on one occasion, he's being so abusive to this poor kid, he punches her in the stomach and then he kicks her down the stairs. And this is after she's just been violently raped. She was 3 months pregnant at the time. And wow, I've got to give it to this young girl. She found her voice. She realized that she wasn't in a safe place. This wasn't going to get any better. And ultimately now she's responsible for an unborn child. And she actually left him before her daughter, Samantha, was even born. I've actually been in a show with those two individuals, and for Samantha finding out that Huntley was her father in the end, can you imagine how challenging that would have been? I feel that at this point, you will already have a formed picture of this man, okay? You will know the story of the Soham Murders, of course. The majority of you who is tuning in will, and if you don't, let me tell you, it is one of those cases that is deeply frustrating because of missed opportunities. But I do not feel I would tell this story appropriately or demonstrate the gravity of what I consider unforgivable errors in this case unless I was to introduce how Ian Huntley was coming to note within the authorities around him. Because this man was so dangerous even now. And yet somehow he manages to go on to get a job as a college caretaker, giving him access to exactly the individuals that he had an incredibly unhealthy attraction towards. When I explore these crimes, it's always really important for me to consider whether they could have been prevented, whether contributory factors that, if they had been removed, would have led to a different outcome. When I look at the psychology and the actions of Huntley, his behaviour was terrifying way before he ended up as a caretaker. In fact, just to bring in the locals in Grimsby, his behaviour was so diabolical in that area, so notable in that area, that in 1999, his flat was attacked. His windows were smashed, his front door was broken down, and I'll tell you why. Because the locals believed that Ian Huntley was a paedophile. The locals. They didn't need the police, they didn't need social services, they didn't need teachers to tell them. They saw what was happening with their own eyes in their own locality, and they were not having it. They literally wanted him out of their area. And I'm going to enlighten you. I'm going to enlighten you now about the prior behaviour of this man, this monster. And I swear, strap in. Because how the hell that man would soon be employed as a caretaker at Soham Community College, a school close to the home of the two 10-year-old girls we're going to talk about today, I have no idea. Remember, by this point, Huntley is 21 years of age, and yet I am going to show you just how much intel the authorities already had about him. So August 1995, basically they look into the fact that he's had underage sex with a 15-year-old girl. Her father's reported it. A joint investigation occurs. Police and social services investigate. That girl actually admits that she's had sex with Huntley, but she didn't want to pursue charges against him, so they drop the case. Then we have November 1995. He gets involved in a burglary. Allegedly, he breaks into a house in Grimsby, steals some electrical goods, some jewellery, some cash, and he's arrested and charged with burglary in March 1996. That goes to court 3 years later. Huntley does admit his role, and the judge orders a criminal charge to lie on his file. Now, this happens when a judge agrees that there is enough evidence for a case to be made, but basically they don't feel that it's in the public interest to proceed. I imagine that in this case it is probably because Huntley said, yeah, I got caught bang to rights, I did do it, and therefore, even though he'd accepted the charges, there was no verdict recorded against him because obviously he just accepted that had taken place. March 1996, again, another underage sex allegation. Apparently, Huntley's had sex with a 15-year-old girl. Social services again get involved, but the girl denies the allegation, so the police don't get involved at this point. April 1996, underage sex again. So another alleged incident occurs, sexual relationship with a 15-year-old girl, and the mother is absolutely beside herself. She tells the school, she tells social services. They exchange information with the police. However, similar to the other complaints, the family at this point don't want the police to get involved. So for whatever reason, they're kind of drawing the line at wanting the police to take it further. May 1996. He's accused again of underage sex. This is with a 13-year-old girl. Joint investigation occurs, police and social services. The girl does deny the sex had taken place, and her mum supports her in saying that the sex didn't take place. She then refuses a medical examination. It is, as far as I'm concerned, really surprising at this point that given the 2 previous complaints involving the police, they didn't actually even interview Huntley on this occasion. For me, this is insane. This guy keeps cropping up. Look, there's no smoke on the hole without fire. It's the same offence that's being brought up. It's the same adult male who's being implicated. Come on. I mean, surely this is going to be creating alarm bells and people are going to be thinking, well, this is the 3rd case where an individual who's underage has been seen to be involved with him or has said that they are involved with him. But then it gets even worse. April 1998. It's an 18-year-old woman. She alleges that Huntley rapes her. Basically, they meet at a Grimsby nightclub and he rapes her. Now, she agrees to a medical examination. And when Huntley is arrested, he just says, well, the sex was consensual. The police at this point are like, okay, don't have enough evidence. We won't take the matter any further. Really? Really? You don't have enough evidence that this guy is a complete sexual deviant? What? But no. Then May 1998, an 18-year-old woman claims that Huntley rapes her while she's walking home from a nightclub. Apparently, when they're walking home, he attacks her in this isolated spot. He threatens to kill her. Again, Huntley claims the sex was consensual. Of course he does, because on the previous occasion, that's what he said. Her word against my word. And the police believed it, or at least believed that they didn't have enough evidence to go to court with it. So he uses this same excuse. But on this occasion, Huntley is charged with rape. But when the CPS view CCTV footage from the nightclub, they drop the case. Because basically the CCTV showed the 2 of them together in the nightclub. And they said that because of that, there was no realistic chance of conviction. Oh my God, what planet are we living on? Just because you're in a nightclub with somebody, just because you're hanging out with them, maybe you're drinking with them, that doesn't mean that you are responsible for being consensual in sex in an isolated spot, does it? It means that it's highly likely you thought you were safe with this monster, you started walking home with them, and then they've raped you, but no. Apparently, no realistic chance of conviction of a guy who's already been accused of it, of a guy who's been indicated and implicated in lots of really inappropriate predatory crimes. Then in July 1998, he gets accused of indecent assault. Apparently 10 months earlier, this young girl claims this guy called Ian had subjected her to a really serious indecent assault when she was 11 years of age. He drags her into an apple orchard, he sexually assaults her, and during that, he threatened her horribly. He said he was a martial arts expert. He says that he's going to kill her using pressure points or hurt her to make her do whatever he wants. He puts his hands around her neck, and then he threatens to kill her if she tells anyone. That is just the most horrifying thing to him. 11 years of age. Now, Ian Huntley lived nearby. He was living in a caravan at this point with his 15-year-old girlfriend, so completely contextual with having predilections for younger people. But he does get arrested, just denies the allegation. And even though this 11-year-old girl has got nothing to gain by making these allegations at all, and even though she's talked about the heinous way he harmed her, even though there's been a high-level sexual violation, and even though the police have got like a list as long as my arm regarding the kind of form this guy has got, they decide not to proceed with the case. Apparently it's insufficient. Is it insufficient evidence? Yeah, it's insufficient evidence. Isn't it always insufficient evidence? There does seem to be a pattern. It's just that I've gone on the computer and there's kind of a lot of similar crimes towards individuals who are underage. That is true. Is that not sufficient? We don't think so. Okay, case closed. Literally, that happened. Is this not a situation where all the previous complaints should have been taken into consideration? That girl, by the way, who made those allegations and undoubtedly was horrifically attacked by this horror and excuse of a human being, has suffered really badly psychologically since. And then we get to 1999. This is just unbelievable, isn't it? That I'm able to go through all of these apparent crimes in such close proximity, all the same kind of allegations, and yet we're still in a situation where this man hasn't been brought to justice. But yeah, it gets to 1999, 17-year-old girl. Well, she claims that she was raped in the summer of 1998. She's walking home again after a night out with friends in Grimsby, so it matches his kind of behaviour, it matches his MO, where she finds herself grabbed, she's pulled to the ground, and she's assaulted, and she identifies Huntley as her attacker. Now, again, Huntley claims the sex was consensual, and they're able to look at CCTV footage showing them in the club together. And the CPS are like, oh, you know what? I think it's gonna undermine the prosecution case. And I mean, will we really have any realistic prospect of conviction? Oh no, I don't think we will. Really? You don't think that you might have a case? No, they drop it. Again, they drop the case, even though there are all these other reports of absolutely similar crimes with this man indicated and implicated. But no, let's just drop this. I have to say, what were they doing at this point? Did they just have some really anti-woman individual as a case manager of rapes in the CPS? And they were just like, she was in a nightclub. She was asking for it. She was wearing a miniskirt. She was asking for it. She was talking to him. She definitely therefore wants consensual sex with him. I mean, it is unbelievable that we are talking about all of these issues, all of these crimes against women. It's worth noting, though, there is a distinct change on this occasion in the way that he is treated. So when they're investigating, Huntley gets remanded in custody and he spends a week at Wolds prison, that's near Hull. Now, apparently, he reported that he absolutely hated the experience. He described it as terrible. And the research that has been done on paedophiles who ultimately go on to kill, the research evidences that the majority of them will have spent some time in prison as a sex offender because it will not have been a good experience. Remember, sex offenders, particularly towards children, are the lowest of the low in prison. They often are attacked. They do not have, shall we say, a time which we would find satisfactory on the whole. And they believe that this can therefore alter their offending behaviour. And that can escalate to killing people, to murder, because that is a way of killing the only witness. So if you can kill the witness, there is this skewed perspective that maybe you'll be able to avoid prison. And Huntley, as far as I'm concerned, is a case in point. Now, this is a bizarre situation, an absolutely bizarre situation as far as I'm concerned, because you have to remember that Huntley, at this point, has not actually been convicted of a single offence, just a burglary charge that lies on his file. Every single other sexual complaint against him hasn't been proved. But the alarm bells with the authorities should have been so loud it would be like the purge was beginning around him. When Huntley walked down the street, he should have been made to wear cowbells at the very least. That's how big the alarm should have been. I prefer the idea of the purge, if you've seen the movies, that horrible noise that symbolises that something terrible is going to happen. Yeah, Ian Huntley walking down the street should have had that. The police, social services, educators, they should have all been aware to talk to each other about the behaviour of this man. They should have all been looking at him. He should have been on their radar 24/7. You know, he's a suspected paedophile in his hometown of Grimsby, and he's known to date underage girls. There were all these nature of the complaints that were allegedly getting worse. They were getting increasingly violent. And we're talking about going from consensual underage sex to rape, sexual assault. He was displaying criminal behaviour typical of child sex offenders and murderers, which is absolutely terrifying. We get to February 1999. 25-year-old at this point, Huntley. Well, he meets 22-year-old Maxine Carr. This is at a nightclub in Grimsby. And apparently she was immediately attracted to him. No accounting for taste, Maxine. But apparently, she liked his confidence. Confidence, stroke arrogance, stroke predatory behaviour, stroke psychopathy, in my opinion. But okay, Maxine, what can I say? Not the sharpest tool in the box. I can't imagine that she was very diligent or discerning with her research around this man. She just liked what she saw, she liked the way she acted, she wanted a bit of it. So they start seeing each other, and even though she is without doubt considerably, some could say almost a decade older than other girls that he'd been interested in, and she was his oldest girlfriend at that point that he'd ever had, she did look really young. There's a massive naivety about Maxine Carr. It doesn't take a lot to decipher that she wasn't emotionally mature. Now, Carr, let's talk about her for a minute. She was actually born Maxine Capp. She was born on February the 16th, 1977. Her parents were Alfred and Shirley. She had one sister, Hayley. Hayley was 10 years older. And Carr actually changed her name to distance herself from her father. He wasn't involved with her life. After her parents split up in 1979, he was absent. As far as she was concerned, she was mostly raised by her mother and by her grandparents, so she didn't want to have an association by name, so she becomes Carr. Now, they struggled as a family financially. But one of the things that was very clear was that Maxine Carr was very well loved and looked after. She did struggle. At secondary school in particular, she was bullied about her weight, and this affected her emotionally to a very large degree. In fact, she suffered from bulimia, she self-harmed, she later developed anorexia. And those eating disordered behaviours remained a really serious part, a really big part of her life, all the way to her conviction. She also used to suffer from really serious symptoms of OCD. So she had this obsessive cleaning habit, and there was a lot of emotional disturbance when she was at school, and it resulted in the fact that she left school without any qualifications whatsoever. There was a high level of vulnerability in Maxine Carr. When you have such serious mental health issues, obviously you are struggling, and eating disorders are like a full-time job, so is OCD, so you can imagine that her eye wasn't on the ball academically, although she wasn't meant to be the most academic person anyway, but certainly she had a high level of naivety, a high level of vulnerability, and I'm not saying there was an innocence around her, because clearly some of her behaviours don't suggest that, but I would say that she was very easy to manipulate. So she ends up going to college at Grimsby Institute, and she obtains a diploma in general care in 1996. People who knew Maxine Carr describe her as Jekyll and Hyde. In fact, they say that she had two faces. So usually she was shy, she was introverted, but when she touched liquor, when she had a drink, apparently that character altered significantly, and she was known for having lots of one-night stands. She's a bit of an exhibitionist as well. So that shy facade literally melted away when she'd had a few bevies. I know we've all been there. I'm not an exhibitionist, by the way. I haven't had loads of one-night stands before I say it in that respect. We haven't all been there. What am I on about? But what I'm saying is if you are somebody who's had a drink, we all know that it can bolster confidence and can change your character. And there are some good drunks and there's some really bad drunks. There's some kind drunks and there's some really nasty drunks. And whatever, it doesn't really denote the kind of behaviour that they are without the alcohol. So sober people tend to act very differently. But where Maxine Carr is concerned, it gives her a high level of confidence, but it also brings out that vulnerability, because when somebody is having lots of one-night stands, on one level, I appreciate we're all sexually liberated, we're allowed to do what we want, and so on and so forth. But if you're having lots of throwaway sex, sometimes that can also mean that you're seeking validation, and Maxine Carr may well have been doing that. She may well have been finding her sense of self and value in sexual relationships. Even though that wouldn't have fixed it, it's a temporary measure, isn't it, for coping? Now, as with Huntley's previous relationship, it followed the same kind of routine. So he moves really quickly with Carr. And one of the things that you see with Huntley is this impulsive behaviour. And when we think about antisocial personality disorder, impulsive, reckless behaviour, well, that's a sign of antisocial personality disorder. They then move into a flat very quickly in Barton on Humber. This is within a month. You know, you don't know somebody in a month. I appreciate that if you're in a homeless situation that you might move in with anybody, but you know, when you've got a loving family, you don't need to move in with a relative stranger that quickly. But again, Huntley gets his claws in, like pulls her towards him. Now, he's a barman at this point. She packs fish. So it's quite a normal life, isn't it? If you're thinking about it from an external looking in. They're a couple who are similar in age. They're both working in positions. They're living together. Looks entirely acceptable. Aside from the fact that we all know she is dating a perverted rapist. There's no other way of saying it. I can't say it in a nicer way. I won't. He's a perverted rapist. Now, as you would imagine, for Maxine Carr to end up in a relationship with Huntley at this point, he has to be nice to her for a short amount of time. So initially he seems caring and charming. Again, just want to throw it in. Just want to throw it in, guys. You know, bit of superficial charm. It's another indication of antisocial personality disorder, isn't it? We expect that. We expect them to be able to be charming on the surface for a short amount of time. And certainly he seems able to do that for a short amount of time. But as you would imagine, his true nature soon becomes obvious, and he starts becoming violent, he starts becoming controlling. Apparently they argue incessantly, constantly, and he actually hit her more than once, and he was known to grab her by the throat. So we're in a domestically violent situation. And around this time within the relationship that he's having with Maxine, he actually finally finds work that he enjoys doing. And even though he's had this fractious relationship with his father and a little bit of a distance relationship because of what went on between him, the babysitter, and his mother, he'd started to build a bit of a relationship back with his dad. So whenever he had the chance, he would actually help his father with caretaking, because his dad had a caretaking job in Cambridgeshire. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, why do we all think that Ian Huntley liked the idea of working, you know, around young people? Could it be because he'd get access to young girls on a daily basis? Just throwing it out there. I have no evidence, apart from all his behaviour in the past. I don't need social services and the police to tell me that. I can just look at it. The evidence is there. To me, he wanted a job in a school, around a school, because he wanted to have access to young girls. 2001, he applies for a job as a caretaker. This is at Soham Village College. Now, the last caretaker, and the reason, in fact, that the vacancy had arrived was because the last caretaker had actually had inappropriate relationships with one of the students. Unbelievable. Yeah. You'd think that they'd be on the ball at this point, wouldn't they? Hey, you know, we're in a situation where the last caretaker actually had a relationship with one of the students, which is a massive safeguarding issue, and he loses his job. Therefore, the person that we must employ next must absolutely be screened appropriately, because we don't want this kind of thing to happen again. Now, think about what I've told you about Huntley. This history of complaints against his name. Complaints beyond belief. I mean, one could ironically argue that he was actually the perfect replacement, because it seems that they were good at employing these kind of predators. Now, it does transpire later on that he had applied for the job using a different surname, but we're not going to let anybody get off with this administratively. We're not, because he had also stated his other name on the form. So he'd put what his name he was using at that point, and then he'd been asked had he gone by any other names, and he'd actually put Huntley on the form. But the correct procedures didn't get followed. It was a massive, serious safeguarding failure, because that man that I've told you so much about so far, he got the job. So he and Carr end up moving to Soham in November 2001. Now, if you imagine for a minute, if we can just step away from what we know about Huntley and think about this change in look, shall we say, that he suddenly got the opportunity to have a good, steady job and a relationship with a woman who's kind of nearly his age, there could have been a turning point, couldn't there? He's got this steady job, this relationship, this property, because he was given a property at this really heavily subsidised rent. He paid £25 per week. And that property was actually on college grounds. So he's got this perfect life to some degree. He'll have money, a partner, respectable career. His parents had even got back together at this point. So suddenly the wounds that had been born to some degree had been healed. And here he is, apparently doing what he loves. But the truth is that Ian Huntley, he never had any interest in a normal life. He was a sexual predator. And he was a sexual predator who was getting worse. Also, just as a caveat, before he actually moved to Soham, what he did was go and tell the neighbours that he and Carr were actually off to live in the States. Yeah, just have a knock on. All right, Brian, you know I'm leaving. Yeah, is it because you're a paedophile? No, it's not because I'm a paedophile. Didn't they kind of smash your house up? Yeah, whatever. It was just a bit of miscommunication. I'm off to the States. Why? Because I've got a job there. Okay, I'm kind of glad, because I think you're a predator. That would be how I'd have responded. But him and Carr get involved in this lie, by the way. So she's like, yeah, we're going to America. Yeah. Both of them completely colluding with one another in a lie. That's important to know, isn't it? So we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. But that's what he does. It's not enough to just respectfully acknowledge that he'd acquired a job. He needs to bolster it, make it more interesting. Although there is a little bit of a cynic in me that says maybe he wanted people to think that he was out of the country, because maybe he didn't want anyone turning up at the school and saying, this man is a predator. Do you know that he's literally been chased away from where he lives because we know what kind of a man this is? So it could have been a ruse for that as well. But he and Carr collude. This pathological lying that we see within Huntley as well, that's another mark of antisocial personality disorder, isn't it? Now, Carr, I think, was very easy to manipulate. She had an incredibly immature nature, but she goes along with it. I mean, I suppose you could say that Carr was maybe just easily manipulated. You know, she had a very immature nature, but kids of 4 and 5 know that they're lying. So with respect, I'm not going to afford her that. Then we get to the spring term of 2002. Carr basically takes up a position as a voluntary support assistant at St Andrew's Primary School in Soham. She also manages to lie about her qualifications to get the post, which to me, again, demonstrates deception. She's willing to lie to get a job, and that doesn't show naivety or immaturity, it shows a deceptive nature. But apparently Maxine Carr had always dreamt of being a teacher, but she did lack the academic ability, if I'm honest. She was described emotionally as immature, so that wouldn't have worked well as a teacher either. But Carr's path at St Andrews basically crosses with that of 2 10-year-old girls at the school. They're best friends, Holly Marie Wells and Jessica Amy Chapman. Carr was a teaching assistant in their Year 5 class. Their faces would soon be known to the whole world. I mean, on every television set in the UK, but also all over the world, everyone was talking about who they were. Holly and Jessica really liked Maxine Carr. Apparently Carr was described as kind and compassionate. Kids liked her, and she even told Holly and Jessica to call her Maxine rather than Miss Carr. And both Holly and Jessica were really upset when they heard that Maxine Carr hadn't got a permanent job at the school, and that meant that she'd be leaving at the end of term. And Holly even went so far as to draw a card with a smiling face, and it read, "I'll miss you a lot. Thank you. See ya. Miss ya. Love, Holly." I mean, it just sends shivers down my spine, just thinking of that tragic irony, that lovely little girl, caring, compassionate, empathic, sad, that Maxine Carr is leaving, and making the time and putting the energy into sharing that with her. On the Saturday, 3rd August 2002, that weekend, 25-year-old Carr has actually been out in local pubs. She's been out with her mum. She would go and stay with her parents in Grimsby, and she'd been drinking. Apparently this is quite common behaviour. She'd go out around the pubs with her mother. As soon as she kind of had, shall we say, the liquid confidence that is involved with liquor, she was out pursuing men. And 5'2" Carr was actually seen kissing and cuddling a 17-year-old boy, in my opinion. I don't think the young man at 17, they've just left school essentially, but she is seen snogging this guy. He's a 6'5" rugby player. He's 8 years younger than her. And from what I can gather, it may be that those two were in kind of some secret relationship. And there is a belief that Huntley did think that Maxine Carr was cheating on him. Although, to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if she was, because Ian Huntley is a horrific domestic abuser and predator. I can't imagine living with him would be fun. On Sunday morning, the 4th of August 2010, 10-year-old Jessica Chapman went to a family barbecue at her best friend's, Hollywell's, and she'd actually got a necklace that she'd bought for her on holiday in Menorca, so she was really eager to go and give her that present. We all know what that felt like when we were kids, you know? You'd bring back a present from holiday and you'd just be so excited to be able to go and share it with your friend. And what she got was this lovely little necklace engraved with the letter H. Now Jessica, Holly and another friend end up at that house playing video games together, just having what we would consider a completely normal Sunday. Now, what about Holly and Jessica before we go into the details of what played out? Well, I think it's really important to describe who they were seen as by their peers and by their family and even by their teachers. They were described as adorable, happy, generous and giving. That's what George Fisher, their head teacher at St Andrew's School, said. We were told that Jessica was more of a tomboy. She had a beautiful smile, cheeky, inquisitive nature. She used to enjoy swimming. She played football for the Soham Town Rangers club for under 11, so she was a real go-get-'em girl. And Holly was more of a girly girl. She was described as bubbly. She was described as outgoing. She performed with the Fenland Majorettes, so she was quite a talented little dancer. She really enjoyed singing and dancing, and she played the cornet. So these are girls with so much potential, aren't they? Throwing themselves into everything, just full of hope, of joy. And my God, they were loved. They were absolutely adored by their families. You know, they came from wonderful homes. On that day, one of the things that Jessica and Holly did is they changed into matching Manchester United tops, and both of them were just huge United fans, and they absolutely idolised David Beckham. In fact, they were both wearing his number 7 shirt because Jessica had borrowed Holly's older brother's football shirt. So they had this kind of connection in the fact that they looked like twins, so to speak. And all you can see when you look at pictures of them is that they are happy girls. Happy girls with a whole future ahead of them, their lives untold ahead of them. You know what, guys? It's these moments, I think, whenever I'm talking about crimes that affect me more than anything, because it isn't necessarily the storm that gets me, it's the lull, the moment before someone's life just catastrophically changes, when the smiles are still plentiful and the simple pleasures are rightly taken for granted. Those are the moments that haunt me most in these cases. When you look at that picture and you know of all the possibilities that should play out, that perfect moment where everyone is still just caught in the acceptance that life is just something that moves forward, and where you're loved and cared for, and where you can expect your tomorrows, and it's captured perfectly. And then a completely different story plays out. This photo was taken at 5:04 p.m. by Holly's mum of those girls, dressed in matching tops. That was just before they all ate dinner. The girls had had the food. They went upstairs at approximately 6:10 p.m. But then about 6:15 p.m, they basically leave and they don't tell any of the adults. They just go to buy sweets. That's it. They go to a local sports centre where there's a vending machine. It's no distance from where they live, and they just go and buy sweets. Now, they've just had the tea. Likelihood is they didn't tell the parents because first they're safe, and secondly, maybe they would have been told they couldn't go and get some sweets because they'd just had food. So they just sneak off to do that. It's a completely normal thing for kids to do. You get CCTV capturing Holly and Jessica. They're in the United Tops. They're passing the sports centre. It's just before 6:30 p.m. A witness spotted them in the sports centre foyer a few minutes later. They then see them again, and the girls are walking along College Road, and they're walking with their arms linked, which is just utterly heartbreaking because you can just feel the connection, the closeness. These girls haven't got a care in the world, have they? They're just going home. It may never actually be known exactly what happened from this point, although the whole nation would soon be aware of the consequences, don't get me wrong, because on their journey back, they passed the college close home of 29-year-old Ian Huntley, and it appears that at this point, Ian Huntley strikes up a conversation with them. The girls, by the way, knew the dangers of talking to strangers, but this guy isn't a stranger. Remember, Jessica and Holly, they absolutely adore Maxine. And it's incredible that when you know somebody who's close to somebody that you don't necessarily know very well, you automatically bring them into that circle of trust. You have a bias. Well, Maxine likes this guy. How dangerous could he be? Because at the end of the day, you trust her, you can trust him. And kids in particular think that adults are usually trusted parties. And he's a college caretaker. Yeah, he doesn't work with them. It's not their school that he's at, but there's this link. So he's a trusted adult in their eyes. It isn't clear what he did to get those girls into that house, but it is thought, it's assumed that he just lied. We know he's a pathological liar. So the belief is that he basically invited them inside saying that Maxine Carr was there. Now, police would later state that it was likely that Maxine Carr was on Huntley's mind because it is believed that he'd just slammed down the phone on Maxine Carr. They had this blazing row because Huntley had suspected that she was being unfaithful. He was in a jealous rage, they believe, when Holly and Jessica passed by his house. Now, bear in mind, we know he's a highly aggressive and dangerous man. He's got a very unhealthy predilection for young girls. He knows he's not going to be interrupted because Maxine is nowhere to be seen. He's going to be alone in that house. He's an angry sexual predator. An angry, rageful dangerous sexual predator who has already, without doubt, raped young people. Carr also would later say that Huntley was very frustrated sexually at this point. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't think we need any more evidence than that to assume that the motivation of getting those girls into his house was certainly a deviant one. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to join those dots, does it? What we do know for definite is that those two gorgeous, innocent, beautiful girls with the whole of their future ahead of them, those loved children, they never made it out of Huntley's home alive. Jessica's phone disconnected at 6:46 p.m. and it is suspected that this is when Holly and Jessica were actually murdered. At 8 p.m, Holly's mum, Nicola, well, she goes into her daughter's bedroom. The house guests are leaving. She wants her children to show good etiquette to come and say goodbye. She discovers that both the children are missing. She's worried straight away. They're good parents. Their children behave. Immediately, she alerts her husband and they search the house, then they search the nearby streets. At this point, Nicola obviously thinks, well, she was with Jessica. I'll call Jessica's mum and dad and maybe they're there. So she calls Nicola's parents, Les and Sharon, to check if the girls have gone there. Transpired that they were already growing concerned themselves because Jessica hadn't returned home. At this point, the alarm bell's raised. The parents begin frantically searching for these missing girls. They know something terrible might have befallen them. And the police are informed at 9:55 p.m. and it sparks a huge hunt because this is so out of character. Immediately, they are concerned for the welfare of these little girls. They put 400 officers on the case. They do house-to-house inquiries. The entire local area was combed for any trace of the youngsters, and I've got to say, lots and lots of local residents join in. This is along with volunteers from the nearby US Air Force Base. So they want to bring these girls home alive. They know that the longer that those children are missing, the less likely there will be a positive outcome. They get posters. They put them everywhere. They give descriptions of both the girls, what they were wearing. Obviously, they've got the photo of them, so they know exactly what they look like, literally moments before their disappearance. Those first 12 hours, I cannot express to you how important they are. It becomes more and more unlikely that a child will return home safe unless they're found in those first hours. Can you imagine how the parents would feel, how the family members would feel, how the community would feel? This is a leafy, lovely community, and two of their darling children have just disappeared. The police immediately are afraid that the girls have been abducted, and so they start looking at the known sex offenders in their area. There are 260 known sex offenders in Lincolnshire and Cambridgeshire. 15 of those were classed as very high risk. It also was posed at this point that maybe the girls had met someone in an internet chat room, but they go, they check out the offenders, they look online, they do the search history. All of these lines of inquiry are ruled out. What is sickening about what plays out, aside from the obvious, aside from we're talking about the murder of two beautiful innocent girls, is that among the local people who were searching for those girls was Ian Huntley. And you know what? He stood out. Officers actually said he stood out from the get-go because he had this keenness to assist the officers. He actually even admits that he'd spoken to them, and he suggests, in fact, that he may have been the last person to speak to them before they vanished. He kind of puts himself in the centre of it. He says to the police that he was washing his dog and they'd come along, they'd asked about his girlfriend, their teaching assistant, Miss Carr. They wanted to know if she'd been successful in a recent job application. He'd basically said no. One of the girls had said, "Tell her we're sorry." and then they'd walked off in the direction of the local library. This is actually what he stated. It doesn't help the fact that I was one of the last people to speak to them. I keep reliving that conversation and thinking perhaps something different could have been said. Perhaps I could have kept them here a little bit longer, maybe changed events. Placing himself right at the centre. What is that telling you about this man? Yes, he forensically wants to keep up with what's occurring, but if you want to be sophisticated on a forensic level, why would you tell the police that you'd seen them at all and talked to them at all? You put yourself in there as a potential witness, but also a potential suspect. But there is something intoxicating for some of these individuals who murder. They want to be a part of it. They enjoy it. He wants to be part of this evolving story. He finds it tantalizing without a doubt. The irony of what he said, the irony of suggesting that perhaps he could have kept them longer, maybe changed events. The absolute dark irony in that is unbelievable, because Huntley was the only person, the only one in a position to have changed the events that day. The police immediately suspect him. They're suspicious of his account. He seems too emotionally involved in the case. He's constantly inquiring about the progress. He asks lots of strange questions. In fact, he asked a female officer how long DNA evidence could survive. Then he joked about killing her. I know, as you do. I mean, we've all done it, haven't we? We've all been in serious situations where life is at risk, or where kids have disappeared, where we're talking to the authorities and we think, I know, I'll have a bit of a hijinks. I'll suggest that I need to know how to get rid of DNA or make sure it's not found, and then I'll kill the person I was talking to. That's what I'll say. Maybe I'm thinking about killing you. That wouldn't alert her or make her think you're a weirdo. Number one, highly inappropriate. There's 2 children missing. Number 2, why are you asking me weird questions about DNA? And number 3, now you're joking about actually killing me, an officer of the law. You don't sound guilty, do you? I mean, genuinely. The thing about Ian Huntley, I said he was average at school. Let's be honest, the brain cells, I think, have been dying all the while that he's been getting older. That same officer also said this. He's got really strange eyes. The eyes are like they're looking at you, but also as though they're looking through you, like you're not there. I think we can all think about killers, that when you look in their eyes, you see that there is this uncanny stare. And we see it with psychopaths. They're not very good at understanding how to build really authentic, trusted relationships, and they believe often that just kind of staring into your eyes makes them look honest, which it doesn't. Actually, honest people do look into your eyes, but they tend to look away as well, because although it makes us feel uncomfortable. But if you haven't got that memo and worked it out, you'll look at somebody directly and often make them feel deeply uncomfortable, and it seems that he did this. Now, as the last person to see the girls, as far as last sightings are concerned, the officers understandably decide that they need to search his home. So they send a single police officer to go and search the home of this guy on the 5th of August 2002. This is a day after the girl's disappearance, and apparently they found nothing incriminating. Although he did notice clothing on the washing line, despite the fact that it had been raining. Also, he noted that the whole of the house, like it had been thoroughly cleaned, that the bed sheets had been washed, and Carr would actually later state that this was the first time that Huntley had ever done a domestic chore in his life. A little bit suspicious, to say the least. Also noticed that the carpet in the dining room was also soaking, and Huntley basically says, oh yeah, you know what, we've had a flood. Huntley was also massively agitated at the time, and an officer noted that there were 3 vertical scratches on his left jaw, each of those apparently measuring about 3 centimetres. Now, he claims that his dog had done it. Like, I don't know why at this point he's not taken to the police station and a group of forensics just arrive on the scene. But anyway, he's telling this story, and even though it seems that there's lots of incriminating evidence, it doesn't happen. The forensics aren't brought down at this point. In fact, what Ian Huntley does is he breaks down in front of him and basically says to the officer that he thinks that he's getting fitted up for it, basically, that he's being suspected of this heinous crime, which he should be, because he's got all the hallmarks of being the killer. I think the very fact that he had those 3 vertical scratches instantly draws my attention to a struggle, and the size of the marks would be consistent with a young child. On the 6th of August 2002, Huntley goes to pick up Carr. She's been staying with her parents in Grimsby. Now, Marion Clift, this is a neighbour of Carr's mother, she's very wise. When she looked at Carr and Huntley, she felt that there was something really off about the way they were acting. She really picked up on it. So she sees Carr and Huntley staring into the boot of Huntley's car. Carr's crying. Apparently Huntley was deathly white, and he notices that Marion Clift is actually watching them, and he suddenly closes the boot, which to me, I can only make some links in my head. But were the girls in the boot? Was Maxine crying because of that? Because Maxine Clift could see they weren't conversing. There was an emotional moment occurring whilst looking into the boot of the car. And the fact that he catches sight of Marion Clift and then he closes it, again, they're only assumptions, but it would make sense. Now, when the pair get back to Soham, officers again call at the house because, they want to corroborate alibis, for example. They want to get the details off Carr and Huntley. And neither wanted to really help. They were very reluctant to even let the police into the home. The police at this point asked Maxine Carr if the girls had been taught about strange danger at school. She said, yeah, of course they had. And they then asked how she thought that Jessica may react, or Holly may react, if they got told to get into a car. Even though they actually asked Carr, by the way, in spite of that being directed towards her, would the kids get into a car with a stranger? Huntley is the person who replies. Can you believe this? That this guy, who really doesn't have a relationship with these girls, he actually responds and he says, Holly would probably get in and be quiet, but Jessica would fight and be mad. That in itself terrifies me. Again, this man has information, he just wants to talk about it, doesn't he? So the fact that he's saying that Holly would be compliant, she'd get in, and Jessica would fight and get mad, are we being introduced to how it played out? Are we being told how Holly quietly complied, trying to avoid the conflict, and then Jessica fought for her life when things progressed? I can only make that link from what he says. But again, deeply disturbing for the police officer, and I imagine for Maxine Carr. It was directed to her. She's the one with the relationship with him. It's really strange that he'd even dare to answer that question. He doesn't know them. He doesn't teach them. He doesn't even work at their school. Now, in later interviews to press, he did start to stress that he didn't know them. So when he's starting to get interviewed for TV, he's like, oh yeah, I don't really know them very well at all. So that makes his answer even more ominous, doesn't it? It implies fully that he actually knows exactly how those girls would react in that kind of situation.
Evening in. You're the school caretaker. The girls, Jessica and Holly, would know you, and they saw you on the front doorstep. What went on?
Well, I don't know the girls. I stood on the front doorstep grooming my dog down. She'd run away and come back a bit of a mess. They just came across and asked how Miss Carr was, as she used to teach them at St Andrews. I just said she weren't very good, as she hadn't got the job. And they just says, please tell her that we're very sorry. And off they walked in the direction of the library over there.
Huntley also claims that Carr had actually walked their German Shepherd dog that day, and apparently it got wet, so he was getting hose and soap out when the girls passed by, and that they'd asked about whether Miss Carr was there, and he said he was surprised because he thought they'd ask about the dog. Again, at this point, the officer's really suspicious of Huntley's behaviour. But anybody who's watched true crime or watched people being interrogated, what you will often find is when somebody's being asked questions, they will bring in extraneous collateral information that means absolutely nothing. And it's like they're trying to build this picture. They're trying to look like they're telling the truth by introducing other areas of data, in this case, the dog. But why would you even think of telling the police that? Your thought process is irrelevant in this situation. There's 2 kids missing. Your thought process of, I would have thought they'd have wanted to know about the dog and not the person they actually have a relationship with. It doesn't make sense. Now, by the time the investigation progresses into the second week, one of the things you can see from photographs and interviews of Huntley, he started to lose weight. Visibly, you can see him losing weight. He's also displaying signs of insomnia, which you do if you're innocent. I mean, we're always doing that, aren't we? If we're totally innocent, we just suddenly lose weight and can't sleep. Clearly, he's dealing with a high level of anxiety. I'm not going to say guilt. I don't think he's dealing with guilt. I think he's dealing with anxiety. I don't like he thinks the fact that maybe the net is closing in. That's what's keeping him up at night. It's as simple as that. Between the 10th and the 14th of August, Huntley is just out there giving TV interviews. I mean, he's placing himself at the centre. He's been very compliant as well. TV crews will ask for interviews. Lots of people refuse. He may well be thinking, well, if I want to act like I've done nothing wrong, maybe I need to be seen to be helping out. But again, if you're innocent and you don't want to be on TV, you don't go on TV because you've got nothing to hide. The fact that he's overtly helping as much as possible, one, we could say he's enjoying the notoriety. 2, it could be that he's complying because he wants to be seen to be helpful because he doesn't want to place himself as a suspect. Not helpful though, is it? Because I'll tell you what, if I was in the place that he used to live and I'm watching him on TV and he's talking about 2 little girls going missing and him being the last person to see them, my God, I am going to be doing the maths, and undoubtedly 2 and 2 will make 4. He's a great big massive paedophile. He's working near those girls and now they've gone missing. I'd be on the phone to Crime Stoppers immediately. But again, he's reiterating on television that he's the last person to talk to the girls. It's also notable that Carr appears in an interview. She ends up talking in that interview about Holly and Jessica in the past tense. Yeah, in the past tense. She's even adding insult to injury, in my opinion here. She's holding the card that Holly had made for her on the last day of term. And she says this: no one believes they would ever run away. They were so close to their families. This is something that I will keep for the rest of my life. It's what Holly gave me on the last day of term, and there's a poem written inside it saying to a special teaching assistant, and that we will miss her and that we'll see her in the future. That was just the kind of girl she was. She was just really lovely.
You knew the girls. What were they like? Tell us a bit about them.
This is something I'll probably keep for the rest of my life, I think. It's what Holly gave me on the last day of term. She was very, very upset because I didn't get my job, and she just gave me this with a poem on the inside, saying to a special teaching assistant, really, and we'll miss her a lot and we'll see her in the future. She was just lovely, really lovely.
That's really very sweet, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's very telling for me to know that she's using the past tense. And we'll never know for sure, but did she know the girls were dead? I mean, did she? Because if she did, my God, that behaviour going on TV, that was seriously messed up behaviour, wasn't it? To be able to lie and to talk about how much that card means to her, all the while knowing that those kids aren't ever going to come home. Well, some would say that was incredibly cold, calculated, manipulating, and callous. Then she actually makes a direct appeal for the safe return. Just get on the phone and just come home. Or if someone's got them, just let them go. So now they're both at the centre of this storm, aren't they? They're both very much involved in this media circus around trying to bring these girls home. And again, they're being watched closely. The police are watching their movements, their behaviour closely. Because these girls have got families, they've got friends. There are lots of people that could be interviewed. And yet here we see these two individuals who have some connection with the girls, but nothing huge. They're the ones giving so many interviews on TV and in the newspapers. Now, I'm going to talk about the girls being found in detail, but one of the things I wanted to bring up is that on the Saturday, this is after the bodies were found, football, rugby and cricket grounds all around the UK, they all held a minute's silence. There were thousands of floral tributes left in Soham, thousands left near the spot where the girls' bodies were found. Chelsea Flower Show, they created the Soham Rose. That's what they unveiled in honour of the girls. And I can remember it being everywhere. Everybody cared about these girls. It was as simple as that. And their bodies being found, it ended the chapter of hope, didn't it? Now, police, well, they're still suspicious of Huntley because as far as they're concerned, this is the guy who stands out like a sore thumb. But Carr has provided him with an alibi. She's told the police that she was home with him on the day that the girls vanished, and she vouched for Huntley repeatedly. And this means that even though they thought there was something really weird about him, they initially ruled him out as a suspect. And she gave press interviews. She claimed that she'd been in the house when Huntley spoke to the girls on the doorstep. She said, I only wish we'd asked them where they were going. If only we knew then what we know. Then we could have stopped them or done something about it. It's crazy that both of these individuals just seem so perfectly at peace, lying to the press. And in some of the interviews, you'll see that Huntley actually smiles. I mean, we all know Duper's Delight, Diane Downs. You want a great example of that? Go and have a look at the Diane Downs video that I did. She smiles when describing the deaths of her babies, her children that she murdered. Why? Because she thinks she's got away with it. And it's the same with Huntley. He can't help smiling. He thinks he's bossing it. He thinks people will believe in him, and he shows it on his face. On the 16th of August, it's 12 days after the girls' disappearance, Huntley and Carr get questioned by the police for about 7 hours. They're later actually placed in safe houses, but they're separate safe houses, so they're put in separate locations. Now, clearly, that's because they don't want these two talking. The police are going to want to break them down, aren't they? If they suspect them, they're going to want to break them down. So you don't want them together. You don't want them to have time to create an elaborate story as to why they are innocent. You won't be surprised that, just as I said earlier on, people who knew that Ian Huntley is a pervert from his time in Grimsby had seen him on TV and had all got in contact with the police. Because as far as they're concerned, he is the perpetrator. So they have to go into safe houses on another level because both Carr and Huntley are now at serious risk of harm. You know, at the end of the day, there could have been a possible lynching. Now, personally, a lot of you, even I, may not feel that that's the taxpayer's problem. Actions have consequences. You go out and murder kids and you meet some consequences. Well, you made a choice. Now you face the consequence. Obviously, in a civil society, that's not what we do. Doesn't mean it's not what we feel, though. And certainly the idea of me having any money taken out of my taxes to feed those monsters really doesn't appeal to me. But everybody has their own opinion. Now, during the police interview, one of the things that the police noted was that Huntley's mannerisms kind of spoke louder than his words. He had his head in his hands. Apparently he was completely stationary for about 40 seconds. And then very quietly he says, to think that I might have been the last friendly face that these two girls had to speak to before something happened to them. Well, I mean, Huntley, yeah, you were indeed the last face they saw. But what the hell do you mean? Friendly. There was absolutely nothing friendly about this man. Quite the contrary.
Ian, was there any occasion that you actually came into contact, physical contact, with the girls?
Physical contact?
Okay.
The investigation continues, and as it does, so too does Huntley's alibi just begin to completely unravel, because it's soon established that Maxine Carr hadn't been with him on the day of Holly and Jessica's disappearance, because the phone records proved it, and she was out in bloody Grimsby snogging a 17-year-old, tongue deep in a 17-year-old, very tall rugby player's mouth. And that's 2 hours away from Soham. So everyone knew that she was lying. It's quite unbelievable to me that they went on TV and didn't know that this was obviously going to get found out. Then police go and do a thorough search, finally, of Huntley's home, and one of the things to notice is that the bath had a recent crack in it, and that's believed that potentially something violent had happened in there. They then searched the college grounds. This is where Huntley actually worked as a caretaker, and at this point, officers are able to locate what they consider major items of importance to the investigation. So these are not potential pieces of evidence, these are major. There's something that directly links what they have found to the crime. And when they are looking, they find in a bin, in a hanger on the college grounds, Holly and Jessica's Manchester United tops. They also find underwear and other items of clothing. They also notice that attempts had been made to burn them, but they hadn't been completely destroyed. So instantly at that moment, the police know, don't they? They know that those girls aren't coming home. Now Huntley, of course, pathological liar as we'd expect. He says he'd never entered the hangar, but because he's, as I said, about as bright as a tortoise. Sorry, I know tortoises are lovely, but they don't seem to be that interested in anything other than slowly walking and eating lettuce. I'm putting him on that level, in spite of the fact that he thinks he can get away with murder literally and just lie his way out of this. The police just find the key to that hangar in a cabinet next to his bed. You can just imagine how Ian Huntley's mind works. I'll just tell them I don't have a key to the hangar. That'll work. It's worked when I've lied about raping people and just said it was consensual. I've got away with all of those things. They'll just be like, well, he's been quite helpful in interviews. Let's just not look. Okay, case closed. Said nobody ever in these situations. So they find the key. So now he's lying to them actively, and they've got these items of major significance to the case, and they know that this man has placed himself at the centre of this investigation. They suspect that at this point they are without doubt investigating a double murder. And the whole of the UK just felt winded in this moment. We'd all been there, I'd been there, my sister had been there, we'd all been in this situation. I was heavily pregnant when these murders took place. I can just remember looking at those beautiful girls, not knowing whether I was going to have a girl or a boy, and just thinking, even though I'd never met my newborn to be, that I would die for them and I would kill for them. You feel that. You feel that without having kids, but there's something that it evokes and provokes when you're a good parent, and it makes you feel violence. Violence. And that's why so many of us are still connected to the Soham murders 20 years after they occurred, because we see his face, we see her face, we see their faces, we feel that loss. The police are obviously now coordinating their investigation on Huntley, and the net closes in because they do forensic analysis of the clothing, and fibres from the tops were a precise match to samples that are retrieved from Huntley's body and clothing. The same fibres are also recovered from his home. Huntley's hair is even found on the girl's clothing, and this is along with fibres from his clothing and carpet. Furthermore, well, his fingerprints are found on the bin. So, bang to rights, mate. Bang to rights. Simple as. Everything indicates that you are the killer. Huntley knows that. But he doesn't know what to do, does he? How's he going to get out of this one? And the police are even able to trace the last signal from Jessica's mobile phone to this small area directly near Huntley's home. They've got all the evidence they need, haven't they? On the 16th of August 2002, they do a forensic search of Huntley's car. It's been deep cleaned. Why? Why would you deep clean it? The cover's been taken from the rear seat. It's missing. The lining of the boot's been removed. It's been replaced with indoor carpet. Investigators find traces of a distinctive mix of chalk dust, brick dust, and concrete beneath the car as well. So, again, draw you back to that day where Huntley and Carr are looking in the boot of that car, and again, it's just triggering for me. It's triggering. Were the girls in that car? Also, it turns out that Huntley had all 4 of his tyres changed the day after the murders. And this is despite the fact that those tyres did not need replacing. He'd even paid the fitter of the tyres £10 to put a false registration on the invoice. He knows. He knows what he needs to do to try to take the police off track, but he's not clever enough, because the truth is there are 2 children who have been murdered, and anybody who has any information with a conscience, with a soul, they will tell the police what they know. And that's what happens. The fitter says, this guy paid me £10 more and I put false registration on it. So again, the weight of evidence is enormous now. The girls' bodies are actually found on the 17th of August 2002. It's 2 weeks almost after the girls' disappearance, and this horrible discovery is made by 48-year-old gamekeeper Keith Pryor. He's with 2 friends, and they discover both of the bodies of the girls. They're lying side by side. The reason that they found them was because of the smell. It's one of those smells that is so recognisable that even if you've never come across it before, it alerts you. You are literally hardwired to know it, because human decay indicates possible disease, so we have a recoil effect to it. It's something that we know is really bad, because clearly we're meant to stay away from it. But in modern days, of course, we recognise that this is something decaying that feels like it needs investigating, because it is so reprehensible to our senses and our sensibilities. So Keith Pryor and his friends go over. They find the girls in a 5 feet deep hole. It's 16 miles away near RAF Lakenheath, Suffolk. Petrol had been poured onto the girls' bodies, and the remains were really sadly very badly burned. It was also noted by investigators that there was a really distinctive mixture of brick dust, chalk and concrete that had been found on Huntley's car that paved the road leading to where the girls' bodies were actually found, so they could instantly make that connection. Also, Huntley was completely familiar with the area. He'd actually been plane spotting there in the past, so he knew it was a restricted area. So he also made an assumption that because it was a restricted area, it would be more difficult for the bodies to be found, because the footfall wouldn't be the same. Not as many people would go there. It's at this point that Huntley and Carr are arrested. They're arrested on suspicion of abduction and murder the very same day that those poor little girls' bodies are found. The police publicly announce that they believe that Holly and Jessica had been murdered, and the whole nation just felt a universal mourning. When the police arrest Huntley, who must have known it was coming, he goes catatonic. So initially refuses to answer any questions. He appeared really distant, very disassociative. At some points he sat dribbling, just looking like he was gazing into space. At other times he would fidget, he'd bounce his hand on his knee, he'd rub his fingers. And this is like a massive contrast to his previous character, isn't it? I mean, he's been on TV chatting, he's seen to be very compliant. So to suddenly see this bizarre decline, the police clearly have to be concerned about his mental health. So they have no choice. They send him for a mental health assessment. Turns out, of course, it's just a pile of bollocks. It's just some really bad method acting, basically. I mean, personally, I think manipulation beyond belief. He just was trying to, at that point, suggest that he was insane. So he's doing that for one reason alone. He just wants to reduce the responsibility for his actions, doesn't he? He's thinking, oh, okay, if I can somehow blame my mental health, if I wasn't in control of my faculties, so to speak, then will I get a lighter sentence, or will I serve a sentence somewhere else than prison? Because we all know he hated that when he went down for a week. But obviously the professionals can tell that this is just a complete fabrication. The police are also now gathering intel, so they speak to an ex-girlfriend of Huntley's, and she's able to literally say to the police, and I bet she was gleeful in this, I was like, please interview me, I'm one of his exes, I have a lot of stories to tell, particularly about the violence towards women, particularly about his predilection for underage girls. You know, just throwing it out there, I'm not bitter, but you know, if I was given the opportunity to absolutely send him down, pray God, let me be part of it. So she says, yeah, just another thing, just another thing. You know how you're asking about his predilections for underage girls and his violent behaviour, and you want all of that intel? Can I just throw this in? Just throw this in. He also told me if he ever got into trouble with any of you, the police, well, he'd pretend to be insane. Nailing the coffin there, and I bet she went away going, I do feel an enormous sense of pleasure that I just did that. Is it just me that would feel that? No, all of you are like, I would be totally doing the same. Now, Carr, meanwhile, well, she did really quickly admit that she'd been lying to the police. It's not surprising, she's banged to rights, she was out snogging a rugby player. So I'm not going to give her the, oh, she realised the error of her ways and she decided that it would be really important to help comply with the police. She knows. You know, the police were happy to drop rape cases based on CCTV footage in nightclubs. So at the end of the day, they're going to be able to quickly get CCTV footage to do the opposite and implicate her in the fact that she's lying. So she knows that. So she's been caught. She tells them why, therefore, she's given him the alibi. So she says the reason that she gave him an alibi is that basically there was a phone call between them and Huntley had said to her, the thing is, Maxine, they came in our house. He claimed that Holly had had some kind of nosebleed and she'd needed some help, that he'd got them inside. Jessica had sat on their bed as he helped Holly, and then he said that both the girls had then left their home. And then he told her that he was worried the police might suspect him due to past allegations. I mean, I wonder why. I wonder why, Mr. Huntley, the police would suspect you. I wonder why the past allegations of you being very unhealthily interested in children and all the rape claims against you might have alerted them to be concerned about your behaviour. I wonder why. It's not that the police would suspect him, it's that the police would look at prior allegations and imagine it was definitely him. But she's been brought into this now and believes that he couldn't possibly have carried out this murder, or at least that's what she's telling the police. So she is happy to give him an alibi because she likely doesn't want to believe that her boyfriend is a double murderer. Or, of course, she knows that he is a double murderer and she doesn't want to admit fully, but wants to seem like she's helping the police. It also says to me that whilst we don't know what happened to Holly and Jessica, the very fact that he talks about blood and that he talks about being on their bed, that makes me feel that there was evidence of blood and the girl's time in the bedroom for him to have created that kind of map. Because that's what he's doing. He's expecting that forensics might find evidence of blood and might find evidence of the girls having been on the bed. Again, this is just me putting a picture together. I'm not saying that's what happened, but why would he give her that information? That strongly represents to me that he's creating a map of where the girls were in the house so that he can make it clear that he was innocent, he was just helping the girls. The police obviously listen to Carr tell this story, and then they say, we have irrefutable evidence that Huntley has murdered these girls. And apparently she broke down in disbelief. But did she? I don't know. It could just be she broke down in disbelief that he had been caught, that the girls' bodies had been found, and that she's potentially facing a very long sentence. Because remember, she has been brought in as at least an accessory to murder at this moment in time. Maybe she didn't think the girls' bodies would ever be found. And suddenly she knows that they are officially in serious trouble. On the 20th of August 2002, Huntley gets formally charged with the murder. He also gets charged with attempting to pervert the course of justice. At this point, he's still at Rampton Secure Hospital. In fact, he remained there for 2 months because he had to undergo a full assessment. Carr is charged with attempting to pervert the course of justice. She was also later charged with 2 counts of assisting an offender. That was on January the 17th, 2003. In the meantime, of course, Holly and Jessica's funerals take place. They take place on consecutive days in September 2002, and they have private family ceremonies because one can't imagine the horror of what those families went through. One can't imagine how violated they probably felt by the press, not because the press weren't doing their job, but just because there was so much out there about their babies. You can completely empathise, but they wanted to shut the doors and have those ceremonies done in a way where they could at least protect those children at the end of their life in the ritual of saying goodbye. During this process as well, around the same time, we have Huntley's assessment, mental health wise, concluded, and they conclude he wasn't suffering from any major mental or psychotic illness. Well, apart from being a massive psychopathic liar, maybe. 8th of October 2002, he gets deemed mentally competent to stand trial. At this point, he gets transferred to Wood Hill Prison. It's in Milton Keynes. Now, he does attempt suicide when he's in custody. That's on the 9th of January in 2003. He takes 29 antidepressants. He's fully recovered in 48 hours. I know that we've seen that he has tried to harm himself when he was a late teen, but I don't actually think the antidepressant overdose was about him dying. I think he just wanted to go back to the mental health unit. I think he was just trying to show that he wasn't stable. He didn't want to be in prison. He wanted to get fast-tracked back to the mental health unit, and he thinks this is a surefire way to do it, and it fails. 16th of June 2003, Huntley actually does plead guilty to conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. But, as you would imagine, for this kind of reprehensible excuse for a human being who steals oxygen from other people, as far as I'm concerned, just by existing, he pleads not guilty to the murder of Holly and Jessica. Carr, at the same time, she pleads not guilty to 2 charges of assisting an offender. A lot of not guilties here, aren't there? A lot of not guilties, even though there's all this massive weight of evidence, even though 2 little girls' bodies have been found. But, you know, just go not guilty. I'm sure it'll all work out. I mean, after all, he's delusional. He's got away with stuff before. Why can't he get away with this? Holly and Jessica's families, because of their not guilties, they have to go to a trial. They have to have that ordeal. The trial begins the Old Bailey on the 5th of November 2003. They bring in an expert witness, a pathologist. The pathologist has been responsible for examining Holly and Jessica's remains. They give evidence. They tell the court that the bodies were so badly decomposed, they were partly skeletonized in fact, and they were been really badly burned, because of that, major organs had been destroyed. And because of those destructions occurring, they couldn't establish exactly what the cause of death was. They couldn't find, for example, evidence of a sexual assault. However, I would eat my hat live on this YouTube channel if it wasn't a sexual motive for the killings. I believe that the girls were sexually assaulted before they were murdered, and I would happily go online, eat my hat, if he would do a polygraph test and pass it, saying that he hadn't assaulted those girls. Because as far as I'm concerned, the map he gave before to Maxine Carr to explain why there was blood there, why there was stuff on the bed there, was all about covering those tracks. It's a horrible thing to imagine that he abused those girls before they died, but I think we all agree that's what happened. When Huntley gets up to give evidence, of course, he maintains his innocence. Now, let's just have a bit of a side observation here. A bit of a side observation. Huntley is not a nice person, we all agree on that. Leave me your comments, we all agree. He's not a nice person. And if you take the nice out of innocence, you're just left with nonce. It's not very professional, Emma, is it? But you are. Take the nice out of innocence, you're just left with nonce, which Ian Huntley actually is. Yes, it's urban slang, but nonetheless, if the cap fits, Huntley, you can wear it. Now, in court, what he does do is he finally admits that Holly and Jessica had both died at his home. But of course, he didn't mean to kill them. It had just been an accident. He just accidentally killed 2 girls. So Huntley decides to tell this story. He says that he'd invited the girls in because apparently Holly had a nosebleed. And then Holly had accidentally drowned after falling in a bath. Apparently the bath was half full because he'd groomed his dog. Huntley said he had slipped and accidentally knocked her in whilst reaching 2 wet pieces of toilet paper. At this point, Jessica had become hysterical. She was panicking, and in an attempt to keep her quiet, Huntley claims he accidentally smothered her to death. Yeah, he literally said this. So just take a step back from how bonkers that explanation is and how easy it is to dissect that. I mean, if I had been on the prosecution team, I would have just ruined him, and I don't have any legal training, and all of you could have found the holes in that story. You're like, so you are telling me that instead of saving a drowning child that by your own admission drowns in your bathroom when you are present, you decide that it's better to stop the other child screaming. So you decided to keep Jessica quiet and just let Holly drown. And then they're both dead because you smother Jessica by mistake. I mean, literally, you can clearly see that if you had accidentally pushed a child into a bath and one was screaming, you'd completely accept that, wouldn't you? And you'd just help the other child out of the bath and hope that you didn't get into too much trouble. Right? Easy mistake. Okay, not an easy mistake. It's weird you've got 2 girls in your bathroom, but if she was having a nosebleed and so on and so forth, you would be able to say it was a complete accident. I'm really sorry she got wet. But no, both of the girls are dead. He then says that he puts the bodies in his car. He drives them to Lake and Heath. Why? I mean, you're just talking about the fact you've accidentally killed people. Why are you taking their bodies anywhere? He then cuts off their clothes, which he says he then took home to destroy. He burns their bodies with petrol. This is bizarre. Also, it's worth noting that his story had actually altered during the course of the investigation. So, according to any new evidence that was brought in, he actually had initially claimed, remember, that he'd only spoken to the girls, but it's as time has progressed and he's starting to think, well, they've got information forensically about the girls being in my house. He then says, oh yeah, okay, the girls were actually in my house, and it's then that he introduces this bizarre story that they had both died by accident. I mean, I don't even think at this point we need a court case. Just take him to a high secure, very dangerous prison and just let him wander in there. ideally with all the TV screens on, talking about the case, because his story makes no sense, and most importantly, he's trying to cover up even though he has horribly murdered these little girls. He's not taking any accountability or any responsibility for him. That's what makes him even more dangerous than he already is. Whilst he's in prison, in between it going to court, he also gets recorded saying this: if she hadn't kept shouting, she'd have got out of the house alive. I was telling her to stop shouting so I could think. She kept saying, you pushed her, you pushed her. It's only when I put my hand on her shoulder and she went for the door that I realised I couldn't let her leave the house. What? I mean, what? What? Why? Why? How does that make any sense, Mr. Huntley? I mean, let's just throw in a few suggestions here, right? So, other choices aside from never letting that girl leave the house. Number 1, ambulance. Number 2, CPR. Number 3, call police. Explain about this tragic accident. I mean, what innocent human being ever in the history of humanity goes, oh my God, I've just accidentally drowned a child. Now I need to murder this child so that they don't tell anyone? And he basically says, the reason that I didn't call the police or the paramedics is because I didn't think they would believe me. Really? I mean, I wonder, could that be because your story is massively unbelievable, Mr. Huntley? Just throwing it out there. Could it be because you sound like a great, big, massive, narcissistic liar? Maybe. One of the difficult things about this case, of course, that we already know because of the pathologist, is because the length of time that had passed before the girls' bodies had been found, so much of the forensic evidence had been lost. However, the evidence that there was did disprove Huntley's completely fantastical version of events. So the pathologist could actually prove that Holly hadn't drowned. So this is immediately contrary to what Huntley is telling them. Now, according to him, remember, she's meant to have fallen into the bath during a nosebleed. Well, if she had fallen in, the blood would have actually been traced on her clothes and there was no blood. So it's believed that Holly and Jessica had died through asphyxiation. It was initially thought that Huntley had potentially strangled the girls physically, but because they couldn't find any compression marks on the neck, what they believe is that he suffocated them, so maybe with a pillow, for example, or maybe even just with his hands, but there wasn't marks on the neck. Now, the prosecution allege that Huntley had lured the girls into his home, that he'd killed them, shortly after they'd entered the home. And they did say that maybe the murders hadn't actually been planned, but when they look at what he did, it felt like he had definitely thought out a scenario like this. That he had the idea of what he would do if he killed children, because of the fact that he acted in a certain way after the killings that we would expect serial killers to do, for example, to kill and then to move the body and then to hide the body and also try to destroy the bodies. So it seemed quite well thought out. And remember, he's already assaulted young girls in the past. He's rehearsed it behaviourally. He knows what to expect. And he also knows that getting those bodies away from where he lived was important because people are going to be looking. So within 12 hours of killing them, he transported their bodies to a location where ultimately they got found, but I don't think he believed they would be found. Also, Huntley's treatment of the girls' bodies points to his guilt, doesn't it? It's a clear attempt to destroy any forensic evidence. So even though the prosecution conceded that he might not have intended to kill those girls in that moment, there was definitely a thought process of wanting to do it at some point to someone, because he just evidently knew what to do to some degree afterwards to put distance between him and the girls. Now, when they question Carr, she just sticks to her story about wishing to protect the evil monster, sorry, obviously I mean Huntley, but she wants to protect him still. And she says that she just helped him clean the house thoroughly in the days following the murders because she was actually obsessive about cleaning. So she was more than happy to. It was her OCD kicking in. She wasn't doing it because she thought she was covering the scene of a crime. She was doing it because any excuse to utilise that particular cleaning ritual was something that she took. She was completely adamant throughout that she had absolutely no idea that the girls were dead. She had no idea that Huntley had killed them. I'll be honest. The prosecution basically tore each of Maxine Carr and Ian Huntley a new arsehole. It's as simple as that. The inconsistencies in the stories were so enormous that everything they said was either completely unconvincing and otherwise proven to be an absolute downright lie. Didn't go well for them. That's probably the best way of saying it. So following a 5-week trial, there was a jury of 5 men and 7 women, and they deliberated for 4 days. They reached their verdict on the 17th of December 2003. You won't be surprised to know majority verdicts were found for Huntley. They found him guilty of 2 counts of murder. Carr was found not guilty on either count of assisting an offender. The jury basically accepted the claim that she made, that she'd lied to protect Huntley, and also that prior to their arrest, she genuinely believed that he was innocent. I mean, we're never ever going to know the extent of Carr's involvement with the girls' murders, but one thing that's worth noting is that during the years that followed, Huntley basically said that she knew everything. He even said and went as far as to say that she was the one who told him that they needed to dispose of the bodies. And he had actually expected her to distance herself from his actions in court, but even he said he'd been surprised at how far she went, because he said that she was fully culpable, and he watched her just basically say that he was the person who'd done it. She had no idea. He had lied to her. She'd just been a supportive partner, and that to some degree she got away with it. Now, obviously, she wasn't the one who murdered the girls, but if there is a shred of truth in Huntley's explanation, then arguably it shows that Maxine Carr is a lot more deviant than she was shown to be. But nonetheless, they genuinely believed that, as far as she was concerned, he'd just lied to her. And again, I'm going to bring in the fact that Ian Huntley is a massive pathological liar, so he could just be resenting the fact that she got freedom, she's got on to live her life, felt betrayed that she didn't keep up the story, and now wants to make her seem like she is equally as guilty, or at least guilty in disposing of the bodies of those girls and carrying out the lies that they continue together. Judge Mr. Justice Moses actually sentenced Carr to 3.5 years in prison for perverting the course of justice. That is quite a strong sentence, so I wonder whether he actually felt that she was more culpable and wanted to make sure that she was given a sentence that was at least representative of the heinous level of what happened in this crime. Now, when they sentenced Huntley, the judge said there were so many aggravating features in the case, so many, but also said there was no mitigation. They said the 2 children were vulnerable and obviously trusted the defendant because of his position in the school as caretaker and relationship with Carr. In particular, he must have killed one of the girls to avoid that girl disclosing his murder of the first. He must have killed her when she knew what he had done to her friend. He concealed and attempted to destroy the bodies of both his victims. His actions in pretending to exhibit innocent concern after the murders demonstrates his lack of remorse. Huntley was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 40 years. He will not be eligible for parole until 2042, and I still do not believe that he should even be given the right for that parole. Yes, he will be 68 years old, but he still deserves, as far as I'm concerned, to rot in jail forever. In fact, he only avoided his full life term because the prosecution could not prove the sexual element to the crime, even though the judge did acknowledge that it was fully likely. It seems unbelievably unfair to me, unbelievably unfair, that Huntley's own disposal of the bodies actually helped him to avoid life without parole. I'm saying that, but the truth is, let's be honest guys, will he ever actually get out? Probably not. He's likely to die in prison. He's likely to never ever get parole. He will always be seen as a heinous threat to children. The judge stated this: "The order I make offers little or no hope of the defendant's eventual release." After the trial, Jessica's father, Les, said this of Huntley: "I think he was a time bomb waiting to go off, and both our girls were in the wrong place at the wrong time. I hope the next time I see him, it will be like we saw our daughters, and it will be in a coffin." Yes, Les, I agree. We'll all line up and in fact pay to see that moment, genuinely. And then let's take that coffin and, I don't know, leave it on top of a mountain with vultures so he can have his eyes and vital organs picked out by said creatures. Just throwing it in there. I think that wouldn't be something that wouldn't make sense. Take up less room, animals will get fed. He'll actually be a bit useful for a change, won't he, as a human being? On the 3rd of April 2004, Huntley's rental property, so the ones that you'll have seen in the press, where those horrific murders took place, well, it got completely flattened. It was demolished, which is great. It says something about that community, doesn't it? They're not going to have that house of horrors, a blot on the landscape. They're not going to make the families and the friends of those poor 2 girls have to have anything in their view that represents those final moments. Not that they need that, it's imprinted in their brains. But the point is, it's a respectful thing to have done, isn't it? Now, following Huntley's conviction, they make his previous criminal history public. Now, just think about this. There's this huge catalogue of complaints, all alleging sexual offences against underage girls and young women. Huntley had still, in spite of that, been able to secure a job as a caretaker, a school caretaker. He was literally surrounded by scores of female students that literally fitted his profile, his predatory attraction profile to those particular types of individual perfectly. So it sparks a public inquiry. They want to look at intelligence-based record keeping and the vetting process. This was called the Bichard inquiry. And that particular inquiry led to a massive tightening of various procedures within the Criminal Records Bureau system. That included compulsory checks into potential criminal backgrounds of people who apply to work with children and vulnerable people. So Michael Bichard ordered the suspension of David Westwood. David Westwood was the chief of homicide police. He had actually ordered the destruction of criminal records about alleged child molesters, which had not resulted in a conviction. Now that suspension, ironically, was later overturned, and arguably one could say, well, he had a right to say that alleged people's records could be destroyed because they weren't actually indicated as guilty. But it also meant that huge amounts of information about potential perpetrators was lost. The Chief Constable of Cambridgeshire Constabulary, that's Tom Lloyd, he got severely criticised. They said that his force failed to contact homicide police during Huntley's criminal background check for his application to Soham Village College, and they didn't even follow standard vetting guidelines, which is horrific. He would never have got the job if they had. So it ends up that both forces get heavily criticised for their failings in maintaining the criminal intelligence records on Huntley. And the report also stated that there should be a clear code of practice on record keeping by the police forces. So that led to the Police National Database, which was created the years after the report. And that was all about aiming to close the gaps in information sharing between police forces. And any of you who've had police checks, DBS checks, you'll know that it's an extensive search of your past behaviour criminally to look whether you're an appropriate person to work with vulnerable individuals. Now, it also turns out that Huntley had applied for the caretaker's job under the name of Ian Nixon. As I said, that was his mother's maiden name. However, as I noted earlier on, he had stated on the application that he had previously been known as Ian Huntley, and the Cambridgeshire police failed to perform the search under Huntley. If that search had taken place, the 1995 burglary charge that was on his file would have been flagged, and that would have led to him not getting the job. Now, Huntley's employers actually said that they would definitely not have offered him the job if they had known about the burglary. He would not have been a trusted party. They would have given it to somebody who was. Because he needed, as part of his job role, to look after school property. If you've been a burglar, obviously people can be rehabilitated, but you are more likely to steal because of your past behaviour. So they would have seen him as being unsuitable for that role. But he did get the job, and those girls got murdered. And that's contributory factors that could have been avoided. Carr was actually only required to serve half of a sentence. So 16 months she'd served on remand at the time of her sentencing. That was taken into account. She also secured a further 135-day cut to her sentence because she was classed as a non-dangerous offender. So she was basically released on electronic tag, and that was after she served 21 months in prison. So those 21 months, as I've said, were given to her for providing Huntley with a false alibi after he had horrifically murdered 2 innocent girls and her own Year 5 students. She got released in May 2004. Personally, as far as I can see it, her actions helped to delay the discovery of those girls' bodies. Because of her giving that false alibi, there was vital forensic evidence that was lost. There was evidence that could have shed more light on what happened to Holly and Jessica, and instead, because of her actions, their families are left with questions that cannot be answered. I mean, let's be honest, it doesn't seem as though Huntley's going to start telling them the truth anytime soon, so her alibi did have a massive impact on the case. Yes, she didn't kill the girls, but what she did was create a scenario where evidence that was vital never made it to the courts. She prevented him from getting a full life tariff. That's unforgivable in my opinion. Why would you have to give somebody a false alibi if they're innocent? Do the maths. If somebody needs a false alibi, it's because they aren't innocent, they're guilty as hell. In February 2005, Maxine Carr actually won an injunction which granted her lifelong anonymity. She basically was able to argue that her life would be in danger if the public knew who she was. So she was given a whole new life. And you're not going to believe this, guys, but in 2014, whilst the lives of those 2 beautiful 10-year-old girls were heinously cut short, Maxine Carr became a mother. Her baby's never going to know her true name, nor will her child know who she lied for and protected. That child will never know that she was part of the Soham Murders. It feels wrong to some degree, doesn't it? That she should be able to protect herself from the shame. I suppose the only thing that I could say in line with understanding the order is that, of course, her child does not bear any guilt and should have a life free from being discriminated against because of who they were born to. I suppose it protects the interests of a completely innocent kid. But let's face it, the lives of 2 completely innocent children have already been destroyed. Carr has now joined what is considered a rather elite group of people, shall we say. She's just one of 4 former UK prisoners to be given secret identities. So the others are child killer Mary Bell and James Bulger's murderers Robert Thompson and John Venables. So her new ID, her police protection, that has cost the taxpayers millions. Millions. How do you feel about that? It's grating, isn't it? Now, one thing that is good to hear is that, well, Huntley's not having a good time. He's not having a fun time in prison. It seems that if you're a child murderer, well, you might find the fact that you might be at constant risk of attack. Also, he's been in really poor health. Now, he has also attempted to take his life more than once, which we don't celebrate, somebody wanting to kill themselves. Anybody who's been in a dark place, it's a terrible situation to find yourself even contemplating. But some people don't necessarily deserve the same level of empathy and compassion that we would afford the general population. So he's had some pretty awful times. 2005, this is in HMP Wakefield. Huntley had scalding water thrown on him by another inmate. That was convicted spree killer Mark Hobson. Now, Mark Hobson isn't some innocent being. He actually killed 4 people in North Yorkshire in July 2004. But obviously, this particular guy took real issue with the fact that Huntley is a child killer. And even though he did have this hot water thrown on him, it didn't actually scar him permanently, but for some reason, because we live in a completely bonkers world, he was given £2,500 in legal aid to fight for compensation. Huntley wanted 15k. I mean, seems perfectly reasonable to use our hard-earned, tax-paid money to just allow child murderers to ask for a bit of cash, doesn't it? Makes you feel warm, doesn't it? That's a bit mad that you can do that. Just sue us. Sue the general public for you not getting the treatment that you want inside. But that literally happened. In 2006, well, Huntley manages to get antidepressant medication from another inmate. And at this point, he records an alleged confession about what happened to Holly and Jessica. And he believes that this confession will get played after his death. The inmate who supplies the meds wanted to sell the confession to the media, so that's why he's gone ahead and done it. But unfortunately for that said inmate who's thinking about making a quick buck to the media, Huntley survives. And when they search the cell, because obviously they need to check whether he's got any other things that might cause him to take his life, they find a cassette. And in the cassette, there you have it, the recording, the confession. And he claims that he had confessed to Carr about the killings in it and that he was planning to tell the police, but Carr stopped him, slapped him and told him to pull himself together. She said that she didn't want to lose her teaching job that she'd always wanted and that she had been the one to encourage him to burn the bodies. But again, let's be honest, even though that's all on tape, it is impossible to know whether Ian Huntley was telling the truth. Because again, he admits to killing the girls in that situation and incriminates himself. But again, he's minimising parts of his actions and maximising Maxine Carr's actions. He's obviously got a bee in a bonnet that somehow she has got away with far less of a sentence than he has. And ultimately, it's a way of controlling her even though he's in prison. So I'm not saying that he was telling the truth. I'm saying that's what the cassette said. In 2007, it's April 2007 in fact, Ian Huntley does actually confess to having sexually assaulted an 11-year-old girl in 1997. That victim, Hayley Giblin, she had gone to the police a year after the accident. Remember, I told you about earlier on? But again, Humberside police had dropped it due to insufficient evidence. Hayley stated this: "This has blighted my life for 10 years now, and I felt I had no other choice than to fight for justice and fight for what I believe in. Yet, I still feel upset that Huntley was left at large, resulting in the deaths of 2 innocent children." What a brave woman. What a brave individual. At 11, she came forward. She wasn't given the care and consideration that she deserved, and 2 innocent girls died, but she didn't let it lie. Huntley was transferred to HMP Frankland in 2008. In 2010, he ends up getting his neck slashed by convicted armed robber Damien Fowkes. Now, Damien Fowkes used a DIY shank. So this is when you basically melt a razor blade onto plastic cutlery, and that creates a very dangerous weapon. And it can actually cause a massive gaping cut to the left side of Huntley's neck, and he needed 21 stitches. Now, after the attack, Fowkes actually asked the guards this: Is he dead? I hope so. I hope I've killed him. I have been planning it for weeks. I slit Huntley's throat for the crimes he has committed. It's interesting, isn't it, that prison justice, where inmates are like, okay, I might be in for some heinous kind of actions, but I feel that this person does not deserve to share the same room, oxygen, life as me. I'm going to kill him because it feels like I'm allowed to because they killed a child. I think we all have that feeling when it comes down to child killers. It's like, it's the lowest of the low, isn't it? It's the most dangerous of the dangerous. It's individuals without any kind of conscience that even murderers and spree killers do not feel that they deserve to live. Now, Fowkes actually received a further 20 years for the attempted murder of Huntley. And he also, just as an aside, went on to kill jailed paedophile and child murderer Colin Hatch the following year. He strangled him with strips of bedding. So this man was clearly somebody who'd been very badly impacted on, I believe, by abusers. And whenever he saw a child molester, maybe he saw something that he'd been through as a child and wanted to prevent ever feeling that level of powerlessness. And he wanted to, in his mind, give them righteous justice. So this is a very dangerous man, don't get me wrong. You can't go around murdering people. But he had a particular connection with paedophiles that he felt they were the lowest of the low and child murderers deserved this kind of punishment. Now, Huntley, again at this point, applies for legal aid because he wants to sue the prison authorities for not looking after him well enough. He wasn't granted it this time, thank God. And he'd actually set out to try to get $20,000 in compensation. Holly and Jessica's parents, you won't believe this, they received £11,000 for the murder of their daughters. That was through criminal injuries. The maximum payout at the time was a possible £500,000. What the hell is going on that Holly and Jessica's parents only got £11,000 each? I mean, what's the bar for getting £500,000? They lost a little girl each because of the mistakes of the authorities, and they got £11,000. Disgusting, despicable. Not that money can ever bring anyone back, but my God, can you imagine coping with the grief and at least with some kind of cushion, with some kind of payment that actually could make a difference to your life? You can take time to grieve. It's a pittance of a payout in this case. It's disgusting. So obviously prison has not been easy for Huntley. And as I told you earlier on, he was a loner as a child and he's also a loner as an inmate. An ex-inmate actually stated, Huntley rarely gets involved in group activity. He never goes to the yard. He stands around by the kitchens moaning he wants more food. He's only about 5'2", but he's over 15 stone. I will be honest at this point, I did need to look up the height of him because I was like, was Ian Huntley only 5'2"? How small is Maxine Carr? But no, it turns out he's actually 5'9". But again, he's not popular inside. Huntley's even come face to face with the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe. And you know what Sutcliffe called him? He said, "You were a child-killing bastard." I mean, even the Yorkshire Ripper calls him names? That in itself demonstrates, doesn't it, that when it comes down to the level that he is regarded by other prisoners, Ian Huntley is considered essentially something you find on the bottom of your shoe that needs disposing of. Also worth noting though, that he seems to have two faces in prison. So even though people say he's a loner, even though people say he's a threat, he's also noted to be quite cocky. He winds prisoners up, and then other days he'll be very withdrawn and quiet. People say that you never quite know what Ian Huntley you're going to get from day to day. So I guess we could say maybe there is some kind of mental illness there. I mean, people who are bipolar, for example, can feel that way, although clearly we're not saying that people with bipolar are anything to do with child killing. I'm just saying that child killers can develop mental illnesses without a doubt. The truth is, it could just be representative of the same scheme that we've seen within his mental health, that he has low periods and he has periods where he's super confident, just as Maxine Carr met him that night, somebody who was super confident. And also, being in prison can't be fun, no matter who you are. particularly when your stretch is going to be till you're a very, very old man, if ever. In 2012, this is 10 years after the girls' murders, Holly's parents, Kevin and Nicola Wells, paid tribute to her. Father stated this: "She was a star, our daughter. She was the kind of girl who you'd go to bed with." He said she was a star, our daughter. She was the kind of girl who would go to bed with a dictionary, so when I read her Harry Potter, she could look up any words that she didn't understand. Kevin spoke of the impact of losing Holly, and he said, "Losing Holly was excruciating, but I have yet to see anything to persuade me that the mother's loss, Nicola's, is not the greater." They say that 95% of parents of murdered children split up, and we were determined to be among the 5% who survive. But for a year, perhaps 18 months, I couldn't reach my wife. Time doesn't heal. Someone got that wrong. It anaesthetizes. Grief doesn't diminish, but you can manage the intensity and learn to live with it. Murder has the capacity to destroy more lives than the one taken. I recognised that from the start, so I tried to take control, to make plans and to exert positive thought. It's incredibly telling that he's able to express that, because that sounds like someone who has not made peace with his grief but has got used to it. And the empathy he has for his wife, because he feels that her loss is great, and not that his loss is not excruciating and enormous, but that as the mother, she gave birth, she grew this child. They also have a tiny enamel box, and it bears Holly's name. It was actually given to them by the forensic officers, and in it is a lock of her blonde hair that was salvaged from her burnt body. And there is something so sad, so poignant, so profound and so beautiful about the actions of those forensic officers. Now, Jessica's parents haven't actually given many interviews at all since losing their daughter, and I think that everyone manages their grief differently, and we must respect those who feel that it's a cathartic experience to speak out to the press, to tell their stories, to write books, and equally it is just as important for those who request their privacy to be allowed it. Now, in 2018, Huntley actually made some confession tapes. Those confession tapes were leaked to the media, as everything is. There is nothing private these days. This is a confession tape that I am making for myself. Oh, how is it suddenly in the media? Because that's how this shit works, isn't it? You know what I mean? People want it out there. He wanted it out there. That's why it's out there. And the media just love that stuff, don't they? They're like, oh my God, a confession tape. So at the end of the day, it wasn't very hard to get it into the media. In it, Huntley, of course, maintains that Holly's death was a horrible accident. But he does admit to murdering Jessica. So he claims that he was guilty of Holly's manslaughter and Jessica's murder, but he's not agreeing to both the murders. And again, when's he talking about the sexual element of this crime? He never has. So do I believe this confession? Not at all. Not one iota. But I'm going to tell you what he says, because we're all going to hold him to account in the future. So just go with me on this. He said,
I am so terribly, terribly sorry for what I have done. The people of Soham took me into their community. They trusted me. They gave me a job and a home. And I betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. I'm sorry for the pain that I've caused to the families and friends of Holly and Jessica, for the pain that I've caused my family and friends.
I am genuinely sorry, and it breaks my heart. No, it doesn't, because you don't have a heart. That's not in it. That's me just adding it in. When it is reported that I have no remorse, because you probably don't have any remorse because you've not actually told people the truth. Again, that wasn't in there. I'm just adding it in. When it's reported I have no remorse, that I relish something, I do not. I can't change anything. I can't remove the day from history. What I have done, I know those girls will be 26 this year with families of their own, jobs and lives. I thought about them when they were turning 21 and when they were turning 18. I know no matter what I say that people are not going to think any better of me, but I would much rather people have the truth about how I feel. I have nothing to gain by saying these things. I will never even apply to leave prison. Never ever apply for parole. I will die in prison. I accept that. I don't believe I should be free. Not because I believe I am a danger, but because 2 young girls are dead and I do not deserve to be released. I mean, guys, I can pick that apart and analyse it for like a day, but just let's take the most important bits out there. First of all, big receipt. You ever apply for parole, and we will make damn sure that this is everywhere so that in the future you are either shown to acknowledge your remorse and to stay in prison because you don't deserve freedom, or to highlight that you are indeed a pathological liar who's still a danger to children. So well done on that. Secondly, you've not told the truth there. You murdered both of them. You didn't manslaughter and murder. You murdered them both. Most importantly, you've never talked about the sexual element, even though you created a map for Maxine Carr as to why there would be blood and items of the girls on the bed. So all of that is absolute BS. But on top of that, how dare you think of those girls at 18 and 21? How dare you think about them with children? How dare you have any thoughts about them in your mind? You do not deserve to hold them within your head at all. And most importantly, the very fact that you say you have nothing to gain, the very fact that you try to ingratiate yourself to others, suggesting that really you're not a danger, in the same paragraph of noting that you accept that you murdered a child. Wow. I mean, just like in the prosecution case and the inconsistencies that they brought forward, so too this confession is literally a whiny, self-pitying, I'm really a moral kind of guy piece of crap. And we can all see through it. Can somebody please send that recording and leak it to Ian Huntley in the prison? I'd be totally up for that. The fact that he said he'd never apply for parole out of consideration for his victims' families. I mean, oh, of course, because you're so empathic, Ian Huntley. We've all noted it from your prior behaviour. You seem like such a nice guy. I mean, you're so compassionate that you'll never ever apply for parole, but you put them through a trial where you said you weren't guilty, even though you were. And he wasn't so considerate, was he, when he lured 2 10-year-old innocent kids into his home and murdered them. Since Carr was released, actually, something I found out that was quite shocking is that now she's been given this new identity, of course, there's been a lot of speculation about who she is, where she is, what she looks like. And they have recorded more than a dozen women being attacked because people mistook them for her. So literally, innocent women just walking down the street have been attacked because people thought they were Maxine Carr. Now, that's obviously completely inappropriate. But also, like, let's just be honest, Maxine Carr ain't gonna look like Maxine Carr from the past. She isn't gonna be like, I'll probably go for that great hairstyle and wear those highly unfashionable jumpers. No one will recognize me. She's gonna change her appearance. And it's horrifying to imagine that just innocent people have been firstly thought of as being a contributor to a child murder to some degree, and secondly have actually been physically attacked because of it, but it's happened. Now, Huntley is halfway through his 40-year minimum term. He's 48 years old now. Since the stuff that got leaked to the press, he hasn't divulged anything further about Holly and Jessica's murders, apart from, as I've said in the past, minimising his actions. It's as simple as that. Now, this tragedy did something aside from introduce us to one of the most heinous child murderers in the world. It also exposed some of the most severe police failings around how records were checked and how they were kept. It also highlighted the massive failures of social services because they didn't identify Huntley as a serial sex attacker, despite loads of warnings. Now, because of these horrific murders, positive reforms have come about, and the hope is that those reforms will hopefully prevent future tragedies like this. But my God, those changes that have occurred, they have come at an absolutely terrible cost. Because there were systems in place already that should have meant that Ian Huntley did not get within 100 metres of the college that he worked at. That he shouldn't have been allowed anywhere near, let alone hired. That the searches that absolutely were in place then would have told the school that he was a known criminal. And they didn't take place. And because of that, 2 gorgeous girls had their lives ended. Now, I cannot say that Ian Huntley wouldn't have murdered a child. I can't say that. But I can say that Holly and Jessica would not have been murdered by him if the systems that had been followed accurately. They died, yes, because he was a heinous child predator, but they also died because of failures in systems that existed to protect. And that is absolutely unforgivable. It's been a long one, hasn't it, guys? Wow. I'm not going to pretend it didn't take a lot of research, because it did. I don't know how to shorten this story because there was so much information that I needed to share with you. I hope you stuck it out. I hope you've learned some facts that you didn't know about this case. Please leave me a comment, a like, subscribe if you found it interesting. Thank you for bearing with this horrendously swollen face. Hopefully in the next month I will look much more like me again. But until then, you'll have to deal with the stitches and the weird swelling. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for your support on Patreon. Thanks for your memberships. Thanks for joining me here. You're awesome. And this goes to Holly and Jessica, two girls who absolutely should indeed be living their lives fully loved, fully lived in the arms of their family. Take care.